I'm part of the United States Special Forces, the Green Berets, and have been for several years now. In my tenure, I've deployed multiple times to Afghanistan, Iraq, a few months in Syria, several African countries. I've been to all four corners of the globe, and I've seen my fair share of the good, the bad, and the ugly that comes from being part of SOCOM. I've got plenty of stories, some more interesting than others, but almost all of them are heavily classified behind red tape that will never be declassified until I'm dead and gone. However, there was an incident a few nights ago that stuck out from all the others, mostly because one, unlike all of our other operations that took us to combat zones across the distant hemisphere, this one happened right at home in our own backyard. The enemies weren't a foreign proxy, a group of insurgents. It wasn't even human. Stuff from that night is still weird, and it's not like Command is going to give us any answers. It's the reason I'm bypassing everything I've been told, disregarding and putting my ass on the line, even if I use false information and withhold names. Plenty of innocent people have died, as you'll find out. An upper command would sooner bury it than acknowledge the deaths and give their families closure. I don't have all the answers of what happened in that Western Tennessee National Park, but I do have enough to let people know the truth. Semi-truth anyways. For safety and privacy purposes I stated previous, I'm withholding a lot of personal information such as names, exact locations, and unit information, referring to smaller stuff that I don't think even the scary 3-letter groups could really trace, even if they cared. I hope they don't. Like I said, I'm part of a SOCOM Green Beret A-Team. You all know who the Green Berets are. You should. My team is nicknamed Raider, a general theme in our company, naming things after warrior culture-esque terms. Raider, Artemis, Barbarian, Centurion, etc. It's a 10-man element. The team lead, a way too salty Georgian captain with a warrant officer, a medic, a comm sergeant, and 6 weapon sergeants. Our captain decided this way was best. Considering we're all in one piece after our last mission, he was right. Our weekend was calm and boring as we rotated on QRF, Quick Reaction Force, for the month. QRF means that if someone, somewhere, needs the green-eyed boogeymen of the Western world, we were ready to kit up and be there at a moment's notice. It just so happened, right when some of us were getting ready to head to the bar and have our 2 singular authorized beers of QRF month, we were called. When we raced back to our COP and got our stuff ready, the captain came with some surprising information. We'd be able to probably make it back for those beers, because we were heading to West Tennessee, of all places. We didn't know what the status was yet. Command didn't give us any information, what the OPFOR was, what weapons they had, what the layout of the area was. Nothing. But being QRF team, Raiders still kitted up, and we were at the HLZ in less than 20. While we waited for our transport, the captain finally got some information. Apparently, a facility in the middle of uninhabited, restricted woods of a national park had activated a distress signal. The woods it was situated in was a large national park in, like I said, Western Tennessee, with a long history of disappearances on its now frequently closed and blocked off trails and campsites. This raised a few questions. What was this facility? Why was it in a national park? What happened to need to roll out the angriest Green Beret team this side of the East Coast to act as its backup? Why were we going there when in an hour, someone in Libya or someone across Eurasia might need us to back them up? The captain acknowledged all of these questions, but assured us that's all he knew. He's been with our team for years now, several deployments to the box and back, and he's always been straight with us. It's how we knew he was lying. Our transport finally arrived, 160th SAW, Night Stalkers, an aviation unit that's been around for nearly 40 years, having dragged every single kind of SOCOM unit to every single part of the world. We expected the Black Hawk they brought, but the armed escort of 2 birds that came with them was a surprise. We were in domestic America. We were going to Tennessee. Why were they here? Even with the Night Stalkers flying at top speed across several states, it still took a couple of hours to reach our landing point. The inside of that bird going full throttle was deafening, even with the electronic headsets we were sporting. It was ear-splitting. And yet, while sitting next to the captain, I could tell he was speaking to someone on a different frequency. This was off, because normally he'd go to the comm sergeant and have to use the radio. But he had a side channel filled in his radio, talking to someone, writing down incoming information. I was able to peek over and saw some of the things he was writing. Mascal, close quarters up 4, no blue 4 on X. The birds touched down in the middle of an empty parking lot, outside of the local ranger station. We filled out to the open area. The birds took off. The captain chimed in on our team net. Raider Romero, this is Raider Lead. Get on the net and have them hold orbit in case we need close air. Break. He then broke transmission and talked to us. All Raiders hold outside and take up security. I'm going to get the damn Ragnar. Prepare for a hasty-ass ramp brief. I just got more information. We all took positions behind some of the parked vehicles the Rangers would use. Just to clear things up, our team was outfitted with GPNVG, also known as quad nods, 4-barreled night vision optics that provided an almost daytime-like view of our surroundings. Couple that with our PEQs mounted on our rifles, allowing us to see and shoot anything at night. As the military says, we own the night. The tree line in front of us was lit up like a goddamn operator rave party as the captain walked back, nods down as the ranger currently on shift followed him. He keyed into our net and we could hear him through our headsets. All Raiders, this is Lead. New information states that the facility has suffered Mascal, situation break. Mascal means mass casualties. Enemy Op 4 unidentified. However, outgoing net during distress call indicates that Op 4 is extremely dangerous and engages at close range. Break. There is no Blue 4 on site. I repeat, Main has stated there is no Blue 4 on site, and we had to drop any and all packs we see. A few seconds passed as the captain looked back to the park ranger. Any additional comments, Ranger Clements? The man, maybe in his mid-40s, balding, he scratched the back of his neck, clearing his throat before speaking. I heard a lot of gunfire coming from down there, and don't split up. Whatever you do in these woods, don't split up. Our medic laughed. Well, that's just comforting. The captain nodded to the man as he held back in. Everyone watch your 6s, 12s and 5s. Let's go. We picked up and moved out. Everyone had their own kind of final moments type of readiness drill they did before they stepped onto the path into the woods. Same stuff we did stepping off out of the FOBs and compounds back east. I let out one final breath of hot air in the cold. Our medic slapped the side of his helmet, hyping himself up. The captain pulled out and kissed a small crucifix necklace from underneath his combat shirt. We headed down the pathway, following the captain in a staggered column. Our IR lasers scanned the trees, rocks and foliage around us, looking desperately for any hostiles that lurked in the darkness. Though, to our paranoid readiness, nothing appeared. But something was definitely following us. When we move through forest environments, you listen to the animals around you. The crickets, the birds, the movement of animals and what direction they're heading, how fast. Moving down that path, I couldn't hear a goddamn thing. It's common when you're a group of heavily armed green men moving through a forest at night that some of the squirrels and birds will run the hell away. But not the crickets or the bird songs in the distance. There's a certain level of ambience that animals will maintain even if they detect humans around. There was none of that. Nothing. Not a cricket a bird, a cicada, nothing. Silent professionals. It's in our name. So, when I could hear a friendly 10 meters ahead of me breathing as we moved through that dead forest, it told me that something else was here in the woods with us, a predator, and that the forest was more afraid of it than us. After a long stretch of marching down the trail, the captain held a hand up, signalling a halt. As it got down to my part of the column, the middle section, he called over the radio. "This is lead. On me. Time now." We quickly rushed up to what we saw was a metal chain link fence. 4 of our weapon sergeants and the medic took up security covering the woodline behind us, as I and the other remaining one went up to the gate with the captain. The Barks trail carried on for a few more meters before stopping dead into some trees. The dirt path broke off and formed a gravel one that led into a sectioned off area behind a chain link fence and gate. A "No Trespassers" sign hung high, and just beyond the gate we could see a small guard shack. The captain tried to signal whoever might be in there by switching on the surefire tack light on his rifle, shining it and lasso waving it all over the booth. However, upon stopping and centering in the doorway, we saw a large amount of blood splashed on the back wall and pooled over the room, an arm laying halfway out the door frame. The captain looked to the other weapon sergeant with us. "Get your kit." He nodded, slinging his rifle as he dropped his assault pack, digging out a small pair of bolt cutters. Each of our weapon sergeants carried a different loadout depending on what we needed. One could be a gunner, another's a grenadier. I can't name him, but Breachman, as I guess I'll call him, always carried a breach kit, just in case. He walked over to the lock, but just as he got the blades of the cutter around the lock, we heard it. It sounded like it came from everywhere, and yet far away at the same time. Maybe it was the echo of the forest, or maybe something attributed to its abilities. It sounded like a woman, yelling in pain, in agony, and yet the voice was half gargled, like it was morphed with that of a dying animal, as it had an underlying low-toned pitch beneath it. It got under the skin of everyone. Those pulling security immediately jumped, scanning left, right, up and down. Hell, even the medic, big stocky dude, grew up in Brooklyn, played football before he joined, meaning he was as yoked as all hell when he got to our unit. The guy who once stuck his finger into a man's neck to plug his blood looked around nervously. The hell was that? Our weapon sergeant with the M46 shook his head as he scanned the far-off terrain, muttering in a low voice. Some horror movie nonsense right now. I remember holding my rifle's grip tight. Everyone was equally unnerved. Everyone. Except the captain. He just told us to press on. "For goodness sake, loosen your jockstraps. Let's go." He snapped the lock off. Immediately, the captain and I moved in and cleared the small booth, as 2 more weapon sergeants and our medic took up covering down the gravel road. It was a guard, no name tape or company logo, decked out in a black plate carrier, the plate carrier of which had been torn into, as a large hole covered the entire area of his solar plexus, which was now fragmented and broken inside of his mulched upper body. No bullet entry or exit wounds, just a large stab wound that looks like he got ran through by a damn lamppost. My breath still got caught in my throat as I grunted to clear it. The captain stepped out of the small booth, spitting hard into the grass, shaking his head. The medic prodded him. "What was it like?" he grunted, walking to the front of our formation. "Doesn't matter, Doc." We formed up and moved down the gravel road in a wedge column. The captain and the 3 weapon sergeants in the front wedge, the medic, me, and 2 other weapon sergeants in the back one, the comm sergeant in the middle. We entered the facility lot. Immediately, the comm sergeant linked up with the captain, and I could hear him alerting Maine. "This is Raider. Lead, we've reached the building." though it makes me wonder, if he used the comm sergeant's radio to reach our HQ, who was he talking to on that other channel? The lot was clear, and we got a good look at the facility. It was a grey concrete rectangle, maybe the size of a small gas station. Floodlights mounted on the bottom illuminated the gravel lot up to the dense, shadowy wood line that laid just beyond the chain link fence. The wood line that was still quiet. The mass skull carnage we were told about was present outside of the building. Several guards, all in various states of mutilation similar to the gate guard, were strewn about the gravel lot. However, unlike the gate guard, strangely, they were in heavier body armour, with rifles capable of going automatic and spent brass everywhere. Me and some of the other guys got online and cleared out the back. Exasperated breaths and muttering came from all of us. The captain chimed in. "Raiders on me. Time now." We hauled ass back to him as we stacked up at the door. Flowing in, we were greeted to a lobby. Torn up, furniture thrown everywhere, impact marks from rounds hitting the concrete-lined walls and ceiling. One dead guard slumped against a red-stained part of the wall, the other in a crumpled heap. A woman at the desk, not a guard, just a damn staff member, sat back in a chair, her entire torso area torn apart. As we passed by her and headed through the double doors behind her, her empty, dead eyes met mine. The comm sergeant eyed her as well as we moved for the door. "Sir, she was unarmed." "I can see that. Keep chatter to a minimum." We cleared through the double doors to be greeted by a porcelain hallway leading into a set of stairs heading to a sub-level. The entire surface, ceiling, walls, floor was lined with ceramic white tiles. Ceramic white tiles that were like the rest of the scene so far, stained with blood, guts, and even brain matter of the unlucky guards laid out all the way down the stairs. I counted 8. 17 so far. A flickering light could be seen through the wire glass windows of the double doors at the bottom. The captain ordered us to flow in through both sides. We did. Pushing in, we could see we entered into a T-style hallway. It gets a bit complicated here. Either end of the T ended, while the middle one shot forward far down into the hall, leading into 2 reinforced blast doors at the very end. 2 immediate labs on either side were reinforced with more wire glass, and despite several crates, impact marks, bullet holes, and even holes made in the glass, they held. "This stuff can't be ballistic glass," our comm sergeant muttered. "Why didn't they just take cover in there?" the medic said. The captain sighed. "Seems to be pointing to a surprise attack from the inside. Emphasis on surprise, jackass." The medic fired back. "Well, sure, but it's just a door." While the hallways outside were a mess of blood, gore, guards thrown around as they were ripped apart, creating a mess of bodies, weapons, and more spent brass, the lab techs had their white coats stained with their own blood. My blood, and I think everyone else's, started to run cold as the pieces came together. Whatever killed them did so indiscriminately. We formed a rolling T heading into the hallway. I was on the right, with the gunner taking centre, and another guy on the left. The captain pushed forward, leading us from behind. The window labs ended halfway, with 2 solid white doors near the double doors at the end on either side, leading to closed-off labs. The captain had us pull guard on both of the side doors as the gunner aimed back down the hallway. Everyone else took up security wherever it was needed. The captain eyed the door, feeling the cracks and lines of the blast door, looking for gaps that didn't exist. Blood had slowly leaked from the bottom, causing him to pick up his boot and eye it. And yet, no openings existed. An electronic pad was positioned on the right side of the door. The captain eyed it. It was a hand scanner. I didn't even think those actually existed. He jumped on the private frequency I keep mentioning. I'm at the doors. Yeah, at the far end. There's a hand scanner." He waited a few seconds of deafening silence. He made an internal chuckle as he walked over to the dead body of a guard, kicking its arm. "Got one right here." "I'm sorry, repeat last?" "Alive?" He rubbed his face, cursing under his breath. "Damn." He shook his head, turning on the white light of his rifle and scanning the corpses. "This place is a goddamn slaughterhouse. How am I going—" A crash emanated from the white lab door to the right of the blast doors, the one I was covering. Everyone paused for a second as the second weapons sergeant aimed his laser at it. The captain turned his head, aiming his laser at the door as he approached. "Might have one, or might have up 4. Wait, 1, over." The captain formed up as the first man in the stack, an unusual practice, but everyone else fell behind. I was the second man. 2 more made third and fourth. A weapons sergeant felt the edges of the door, then tried the handle. Locked. Him trying the handle must have alerted whatever was inside, because a voice bellowed out, I'm in here. Please, I'll let you in. Just don't shoot." The doorman looked at the captain, who nodded. "Might have blue 4 inside. Stay sharp. Wait on me to fire." There wasn't supposed to be any blue 4 on site. The door's electronic lock opened. The doorman grabbed the handle and pulled it open as the 4 of us entered the room. We pushed through. The captain hooked left, I pushed forward, the other 2 followed one of us respectively. Our lasers entered the room and a pair of hands emerging from behind a lab table. "Please," the voice weakly shouted. The captain stormed over. "Hands, now! I'll shoot you, I swear to God, if you don't put your goddamn hands up." As the person stood up, we saw the hands were connected to a scientist, possibly late 30s, stringy hair with circular glasses that flew off when the captain closed the distance, shoving him against a metal cabinet, spittle flying from the bearded mouth behind the NVGs as he barked at him. "ID, where is it? Show it!" The captain began roughly searching the lab tech as he pulled out his ID. He grabbed it, shoving him to the weapons sergeant on his side of the room. The lab tech was kicked down to his knees. The captain jumped back on the frequency. "I'm back. Possible blue 4. Prepare for ID code." He read it off in phonetics before he got the response. He looked at the weapons sergeant guarding the lab tech. "Get his ass up." "Please, I don't know what's going on. I was just running some chemical tests. We've got to get out of here before—" The captain got in the man's face. "Shut up." He did. "You know what you've been doing. I know what you've been doing out here. Open them doors now." The man was shocked as the captain continued. "Open the damn doors now!" With a point from the captain, the weapons sergeant shoved the man forward into the doorframe. The man crumbled a little bit as the captain laughed. "Take your sweet time, Doctor. Let's go." I picked him up by his shirt collar and dragged him over to the blast doors. The captain pushed him out of my grip, shoving his face into the door. "Hand on the scanner, now!" As the captain grabbed the man by his wrist, the lab tech struggled to get free. "Please, I don't have access. I hurt my hand trying to hide. Let me go." The medic winced at the sight a bit. Uncharacteristically of a Green Beret, especially for a jaded as hell medic, he spoke up. "Cap, come on." The captain just turned, staring daggers into the man as he wrestled from the man's wrist. "Just wait till you'll see. I'm telling you." As the man struggled against the captain, the weapons sergeant came up from behind, shoving the man into the blast door, allowing the captain to easily place it on the scanner. The scanner lit up in a bright blue as several lines traced and looked over his handprint. It then flashed green as the electronic lock of the blast doors began to open up. The captain dropped the man. "Well, goodness gracious, what do you know?" The doors slowly pulled open. The room was dark. Red flashing emergency lights flashed all around as the sound of broken glass scraped against the door. A stream of murky blue liquid mixed in with the blood of several guards' bodies that were revealed as the doorway leaked out into the hall. The captain grabbed the lab tech by the collar, dragging him to his feet. "You all know these men, Doctor? Friends?" The captain shoved him through the doorway, the lab tech slipping on the fluids and glass, cutting his right hand with a wince. We flowed in and... Jesus. I said this at the start. I've been all over. I've seen mass graves that terrorist cells have used in far-off countries filled with entire villages worth of people. I've seen kill dens inside tunnel systems. This surpassed all of that. Every horror, every war crime, multiple times over. A series of glass tubes lined the walls made out of monitors, hard drives and computer systems. The path of carnage led through the pile of guards at the doorway. That makes 24 armed personnel that were taken out by something. What really bothered me was that in those murky, green and blue glass tubes, as big as a refrigerator, connected to a port at the top and bottom, tubes and wires inside connecting to. The captain shoved the lab tech into a glass tube. The pop of the man's nose echoed off the empty area as he grabbed his nose. "Well, Doc, which one was it? Which goddamn tube?" Tube? What was he talking about? How did he know? Who was on the frequency? The lab tech spit out blood, leaking into his mouth as the captain, standing at 6'5", a giant, even amongst his team, brawny SOF operators, picked him up by his collar of his blue undershirt. "I don't..." Two weapon sergeants ducked out of the way as the captain got on his face, shoving him against the left side wall, causing the monitors and computer systems to beep and light up. "Oh, you don't know? And yet your little hand opens the room that you didn't have access to," he roared, abandoning all silence and discretion now as the man began to sputter and sob. Please, I... The captain gritted his teeth. He quickly flipped up his nods and stared daggers into the man's soul. "How many people did you snatch off that trail? How many? What kind of butchering you do to those kids before you stuck them in there? Which one escaped?" Kids. Butchering. Something in my mind stopped, and I switched on my rifle's tack light. A heavy pit in my stomach formed as I flashed it on the tubes. There were people in those tubes. They were people. Wire and tubes now poked into see-through and murky flesh as the bodies of the kidnapped floated, mutated, dissected and changed. One person's skin ran reptilian-like up their left arm, before merging with a strange gaping hole in their chest, their skull protruding out of their skin in their head. My breathing stuttered a bit as I backed up a few steps, glass crunching under my boots, curses muttered by the others in the room as we all began to look. Another one's mouth was sealed at the front. Two more jagged, messed up sets of teeth poked out either side. Their eyes were sealed, skin covering defined sockets in their head. The medic flashed his on one, where their spine stuck out through their back. The vertebrae was larger than a normal person's, the bones sticking out inches longer in some areas. "Jesus, man, this is..." He gagged a bit, coughing as he looked away. I had to pry my eyes away. My mind was frying just looking at... "They better be dead. Oh, I swear to the Lord himself if they ain't," the captain said sternly as the man sobbed and nodded. "Yes." The captain raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" "Yes, they died during surgery." "If you're lying to me, I swear to God, I will make you euthanize every single one." The captain shoved the lab tech forward into the center of the aisle. I looked down, shaking my head as the images of those things burned into the film of my brain. "Where's she gone, Doctor?" the captain said, sternly, squaring up to the man, who sobbed as he shrugged. I... "Where is it?" The man continued to cry. He escaped. He killed everyone. He cut through the guards. He cut through everyone. All of my friends." This caused the captain to nearly bust a blood vessel from the look he gave him, balling up his fist and driving the arm and knuckle of his ugly glove into the gut of the lab tech. This caused the smaller, weaker lab tech to buckle over, dropping to his hands and knees, now favouring an injured hand and probably a burst spleen. "Your friends? Your friends? You mean the friends that kidnapped a 22-year-old girl and a 14-year-old son and turned them into monsters? What about them?" This earned only more sobs from the lab tech as the captain turned, hands on his hips as he scoffed. He looked at the medic, who only stared back through his notes. The captain turned to look at him. "You got to the count of 10, and if you don't give me a single whereabouts of this thing, I will start grabbing tools and cutting your little Weasley ass up like you did to these kids." The captain loomed over the man, grabbing him by his hair. Sir, please," the lab tech pleaded. 1, 2, 3. The captain counted. Some looked away, others shook their heads. There wasn't a man in the room who wouldn't do what he did right now after seeing them. It's in the woods. You heard it. It did its freaky yell just like 10 minutes ago." The captain laughed, letting go of the man's hair as he whipped his head forward. "Y'all hear that? It's in the woods." He pulled out his M17, his 9mm sidearm, pulling the slide back a bit to make sure it was chambered. 4, 5, 6. The man stood up, and at this point, I kicked out his extended leg, dropping him back to his knees. The man looked at me, then at the captain. "You can't do this. This is illegal." Before the captain could finish his count, we heard it. It echoed all the way down the facility halls, reverberating off the glass tubes in the room. That half-feminine, half-monstrous cry. Except this time, it didn't come from far-off mountains or trees. It came from the stairs. Then the lights went out. I don't know if it was prior damage to the facility or electric works or something else, but they zapped out. The lights in the halls, the lights on the stairs, the lights in the room, the electronics, the lights in the tanks, all of it. He cried out again, and this time, I think I heard it say, "Help me." Anyone who had their nods up flicked them down. All of us trained our lasers down the dark hall beyond the door. The slight shakiness of all the green lasers told the same stories. All of the death, all of the stuff in the tanks. It had everyone spooked. The captain came up alongside me, and the medic. He looked back to the lab tech. "You run, you die." The man swallowed and smothered his misery. I know." The captain corrected him in a low tone. "No, you really don't." The creature cried out again. "Help me." The sounds of something hard impacting the tile floor sounded out as it approached us through the dark abyss. More footsteps, then another cry. "Help me." The gunner let out a shaky breath as he cracked his neck. More footsteps, then another cry. "Help me." It was maybe 5 meters from the door now. "Lord Almighty," the captain muttered. I couldn't see much in that darkness then, but I saw what everyone else saw. I saw enough. Its body was easily 6 feet tall. 2 gigantic, bony, mantis-like legs that were dark from blood stepped into the doorway. Its head was smooth, its large teeth shining in the darkness, and its eyes glowed like an animal. Its eyes glowed. It could see us. We all froze. We had rifles trained on it, a damn machine gun trained on it, a room full of Green Berets, the best of the best, and everyone froze. The captain was first to fire, slamming his trigger as he shot 223 death into that crime against existence. The gunner opened up as well, and then the medic. 2 more weapon sergeants also shot. It yelled at us, cried out like an agonized woman pleading for help. Then, it lunged. Running and slamming through a test tube, glass flew everywhere, causing several of us to shield our faces as the water flooded the floor, and the deformed body that was inside flopped down near our feet. A horrendous, rotted smell filled the air. "Jesus!" the medic sputtered out, gagging a bit as he kicked it away. The creature now screamed. As a rifleman that it jumped near backed up, it leapt on top of him, shoving that bony mandible into his left shoulder, pinning him to the ground as he screamed, thrashing his elbow into the thing as he kicked its stomach. But it didn't attack him. It just eyed the scientist. He attempted to run for his life, but the thing jumped on top of him, pinning him face first into the murky, wet floor. That's when I noticed the 6 smaller, human-like arms on its torso. Its main mandible pinned him to the ground. The arms, some normal, some with bony spikes for fingers, others just lined with sharp teeth, began to rip into the man's back. The lab tech screamed. His lab coat was torn open as he began to dig down into his back. Some still fired shots, but it didn't even react. It didn't even move. Just continued to tear into that vile but poor son of a gun. The captain's voice lit up the comms as he and the medic rushed to pick the man up and heave him on the captain's shoulders. "We can't engage him here. Outside, now." He was right. It thrived on close quarters. It ran guys through before they could pick it apart. We all ran, nerves shot, weapons hot from firing into a thing that didn't react. The power off, so we couldn't close the blast doors. All we could do was run. I nearly slipped on the glass as we booked it out of there, firing some desperate pot shots into the lab with the gunner. The lab tech's screams echoed throughout the hallway as we booked it up the stairs. It was gonna be done with him soon. The gunner and I covered the captain as we broke out into the open air, the smell of rotten death replaced by the open piney air of the forest. Several men broke out road flares, tossing them everywhere, giving us much needed light in the form of greens, blues, reds and purples. The captain dropped the man behind a beaten up and wrecked sedan as the medic began to patch him up. The gunner deployed his bipod and aimed at the doors of the facility from the car's hood. The captain positioned different men to where they could all fire on the door, far enough away from the thing's grasp. "Romero, get on that damn net and call in that air." I took aim behind a large SUV with several others. We all aimed at the door. The screaming had stopped. The silence was broken by its bony mandibles as it rushed out into the open air, and with all the flares and chem lights and even the captain's tack light, we finally got a good look. Its skin was a mix between pink from its exposed muscles to a see-through clear layer covering other parts. Bony, calcium-like armor had formed over a lot of its body, and its back to legs formed smaller, mandible-like features at the back. And its head, an exposed skull, all 2 human eyes peering out in a rage as its larger, unhinged jaw opened, and it roared out its deafening cry at us. The gunner was the first to open up. A blast of 5.56 tore through the armor on its mandible legs and torso. The thing recoiled at first, and then hissed as it charged forward. The captain ran from his place in front of the sedan's side. The thing stuck its 2 large mandibles into the roof, badly denting it. The medic quickly covered the wounded weapon sergeant, shielding him as the thing peered down at the 2. The captain quickly got its attention, aiming fire at the back of its head. It roared with a vengeance as it charged at the captain. He fell back to the sedan, running out of our line of fire as the thing barreled towards us. The thing stuck a mandible inside the hood, impaling it, and then another just to my left. I circled around and behind it as I fired. It cried out, blood now pouring from its wounds as its calcium plating was cracked and falling off en masse. The thing turned to me, and as I flicked my M4 to auto and laid into it, it just barreled at me, shoving me to the ground. Its smaller, demonic hands reached for me as I kicked them away. Its jaws snapped as I held my rifle in the way, shielding my face as it gnawed on the metal. The gunner then blasted a chunk of its exposed skull away, staggering it as it turned. The captain whipped his stock into the thing's head, then backpedaled as he fired off another burst of rounds. The thing turned at him, roaring viciously as the captain dropped his empty mag. He slapped in a fresh one as the thing lunged at him, both mandibles raised. The glass exploded out of the SUV's windows as the captain dropped levels, firing into its stomach as he circled out back into the open. The creature roared as it went to move for him again, but it couldn't. Its large mandibles were stuck all the way inside of the vehicle. The captain let his rifle hang slung on his front as he reached for something in his kit. An M67 fragmentation grenade. "Get back!" Everyone who was in the open ducked for cover. The gunner and several weapon sergeants retreated behind a series of concrete jersey barriers. I ran and slid behind the sedan, helping the medic to shield our wounded battle buddy. I heard the distinct sound of a spoon flying and the whistling of the grenade. The captain vaulted himself over the car hood with the comm sergeant, covering his radio operator's head as they both went prone. The explosion was thunderous. The shockwave of the grenade shook everyone and even rattled me a bit from being so close. Shrapnel and fragments flew everywhere, impacting the concrete barriers, the building. Any windows in the sedan that weren't already broken were shattered. A few seconds passed as we all hesitantly started to lift our heads, then dropped them as the SUV's gas tank seemingly erupted and detonated, engulfing the wreck in a fireball so large it felt like the flames were touching my face. The captain popped up, aiming on top of the hood of the car. Then I and several others joined him, peeking from behind our point of cover as we looked to see if that had done it. The SUV was a burning skeleton, an inferno from all of the ignited gasoline covering the frame and the ground around it. And the beast, as it defiantly pulled its last remaining mandible, its front left one, the only appendage it had left, and stumbled out from the flames. Its skin popped, its muscles boiled, and with all of the see-through skin and bone plating torn and burnt off, it gazed around. Its eyes ruptured and melted. "Help me." The gravel crunched as its charred and still burning body slumped forward. The captain emerged from behind the Vic as only a few of us dared to approach the thing. He lifted his nods, this time pulling his M17 back up and aiming at the thing's head. 3 shots into the thing's head, the damaged and charred skull caving in. A circle of light illuminated us as the rotary blades of the Black Hawk sounded out overhead. I shielded my face and lifted my nose to avoid the spotlight blinding me. "Op 4, actual down, building secure." The ensuing hour was one that was just shrouded in, I don't know, mystery, I guess. The captain went against prior missions of telling us to go prone and pull security, putting the gunner at the sedan by the gate and telling the rest of us to watch the wood line. When the van showed up, that's when he told us to chill out. They weren't really vans. They were more like armoured trucks. Now, for the sake of being classified and remaining anonymous, I can't divulge a lot about them. I'm definitely not saying the black shirts were wearing black multicam combat uniforms with kits, weapons and gear available that would definitely make them a private sector group. I'm not saying their uniforms were sterilised with all patches, logos and markers stripped. I'm also not saying the hazmat suits looked way beyond anything our MOPE system has. I'm not saying they brought several metal cases in from their armoured Vics. and I'm not saying they brought in advanced surveillance drones with them. I will say, they weren't really hostile. Damn, one even offered us a cigarette. The bird landed at the opposite side of the building, the open lot where they eventually told us to head. We prepared our guy for case vac on a litter with a Black Hawk and loaded up as the captain finished talking to some guy in a suit. He was much shorter, maybe 5'8". He bore the look of a younger, but still weathered man. His hair was slicked back and had a hard part. A slight bump underneath his sports coat told me he was armed. The captain eventually joined us as soon as the aviation crew shut the door. He popped his helmet off, much to their anger, and slumped back in his seat. When we touched base and got back to the COP, our sister team, Artemis, replaced us on QRF. I've been thinking about this for days now, about what those people did to them in that lab. What the captain said. They kidnapped them, cut them up, changed them. All for what? Some sick fantasy? Who even owned the lab? There were no US markings, no logos, zip. Like I said before, there's still a lot I don't know. But what I do know is that those guys got exactly what they deserved. That thing, crying out for help, pleading for us to make its suffering end. The more I think about it, the more it makes me sick. I don't know who the hell those guys were that relieved us, but they didn't have any markings. Some of them were speaking German, if my memory serves. But whoever they are, I hope they learn from their mistakes and never tamper with that evil again. I don't know how long this will stay up for. 3-letter agency spooks are usually pretty good at finding these sorts of things and shutting them down before it can spread too far. But hopefully, I've left out just enough trigger words to keep their automatic software from picking this up immediately. But that probably won't be enough in the end. They'll find this, and me, and that'll be the end of that. You should also know that I've changed the names of everyone involved here, as well as some other details for the sake of security and privacy, at least for as long as I still have it. Some of these guys had family, and I don't want any of them stumbling across this. It's always difficult to decide where to begin this story, no matter how many times I've written this draft without hitting submit. But I suppose that everything really kicked off in early 2015 when my unit was deployed to Afghanistan. We'd been rotating in and out of country for going on 3 years by that point. Despite what the talking heads in DC said about drawdowns and sending troops home, there were more active operations in that part of the world than most people would imagine. They'd just gone under the radar. More clandestine activity, less open warfare than before, secret squirrel stuff, as our CEO liked to put it. I won't say exactly who we were. Comes with the nature of our job, you know. But to keep things broad, our unit fell under the purview of the United States Joint Special Operations Command, or JCOC, a catch-all command structure for certain special forces units in the American military. Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps. Hell, I'm pretty sure there were even a few Coast Guard guys floating around in there somewhere. We weren't the kind of guys that just walk around patrolling villages or sweeping for IEDs. That wasn't in our job description. I still remember what one of my instructors said to me. We do bad things to bad people. You didn't get into the Special Forces because you wanted to win hearts and minds. Most of our missions were pretty cut and dry. At least as cut and dry as clandestine operations can be. Rage, HVT capture/kill stuff, and lots of intelligence gathering. I lost count how many hours we wasted sitting on some frozen mountainside, staring through a spotting scope, counting how many times some potential insurgent went out to feed his goats. But in January of that year, we all got thrown for a loop when some CIA Grand Branch agents showed up at our forward operating base, FOB, seemingly out of nowhere, telling us that we were tasked with the most critical mission of the past 50 years, even more so than the Bin Laden raid. I'll admit that not many of us believed him at first, but as he showed us recon photos, phone transcripts, surveillance footage, all the pieces fell into place and we all nearly crapped a brick. According to him, the CIA had been tracking a terrorist cell operating out of Afghanistan who were trying to get their hands on nuclear material, either to make a dirty bomb or a proper nuke, it didn't matter. Now, this wasn't news to us. Al-Qaeda had been trying to obtain a nuclear bomb for decades at this point, but this group, simply known as the Brotherhood, had actually succeeded. Based on CIA intelligence, they got in touch with a former Soviet general who had access to a non-trivial amount of nuclear material, specifically weapon-grade plutonium. They'd gone into Tajikistan, done the deal, and were now on the way back to Afghanistan. CIA and other assets had tracked them as far as the Afghan border, and then they disappeared into the mountains, seemingly without a trace. And that's where we came in. Operation Condor. All in all, it wasn't a terribly complex mission. Find the bad guys, kill their asses, and secure the plutonium. But simple didn't mean easy. The area was god-awful mountain terrain, with almost zero friendly forces in the immediate vicinity and with a strong enemy presence. We bounced ideas back and forth for a good few hours until settling on a plan. One team of 10 guys inserted via helicopter near the last known location of the target. They would hike in, engage the enemy, secure the asset, and then extract. It was tempting to send in every warm body we had for the extra firepower, but more men on the ground meant more prominent signature for the enemy. It's much easier to sneak 10 dudes into a spot rather than 40. I didn't hesitate to volunteer. It wasn't out of bravado or wanting the glory or hunting for the next adrenaline surge or anything like that. I'd just gotten bored of doing nothing but tedious recon missions for weeks on end. Plus, I'd attended some extra training for dealing with CBRN threats, so it made sense for me to tag along. After the team was picked, we spent most of the night hammering out the details, trying to think of every possible contingency and how to plan for it. But we all knew there were going to be things you just can't see coming in advance. In the words of the great Mike Tyson, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. The moon was full the next night as we got our gear together and boarded the helicopters. Thankfully, the snow had stopped, though it was still bitterly cold. I tried to bundle up as best I could in the back of the Chinook as it rumbled to life, the scream of the rotors soon drowning out the podcast I'd been blaring through my headset. Some guys just sat, others talking over the communication system on board, but I just tried to sleep. You never knew when those extra few minutes of shut-eye would come in handy later on. Joey, our team lead, woke me when we were 10 minutes out from the landing zone. I checked my equipment one last time and pulled the night vision goggles down over my eyes, flicking them on and blinking as my vision was filled with a pale green light. The airframe shook under us as the helicopter dipped below the mountain summits, winds buffeting the aircraft and shaking it like a tin can in a hurricane. But to his credit, the pilot did his job, and we touched down a few moments later, rushing out into the frigid night air as the rotor wash kicked up a flurry of snow and ice. As soon as the last man cleared the ramp, the Chinook lifted off, blasting the squad with one last torrent of wind before disappearing into the night sky. And as the sound of the rotors faded to nothing more than a faint rumble in the distance, we were left in nearly total silence, save for the low moaning of the wind through the mountain pass. The snow was up to my ankles, a light powder that seemed to vanish as soon as the wind caught it. We started moving right away, making our way up the side of the mountain with only our night vision to see. It was just after 3 in the morning when we reached our first checkpoint, a rocky crag jutting out from the side of the mountain. Carlos, our radio guy, stopped to get the message back to command as we all took a knee and tried to catch our breath. I grew up in the mountains of Colorado and was no stranger to hoofing it long distances, but the altitude here was another beast entirely. I was still panting as he gave us the thumbs up and relayed the return message from command. No new intel. Stay on mission. The sky to the east began to lighten as we made it to the next checkpoint a few hours later. Almost 3 hours of hiking and we'd covered less than 2 miles. Already we were tired and sore, but everyone put their discomfort aside to focus on the task at hand. Descending into a long draw that led down towards the last known target location, the terrain began to change around us. Barren snow and rock gave way to thin forests of pine and shrub, offering us some concealment from any hostile eyes that may be watching. But, if anything, we were growing more anxious by the moment. Daylight was when the insurgents came out to play, especially around dawn. Joey called us together an hour later and we took a knee, talking in hushed voices. "All right," he said, glancing between each of us. "We've got two options here. Either we keep going now and risk getting caught out in the daylight, or wait until dark. But it's going to be a pain trying to find anything once the sun goes down, even with NODs. Thoughts?" I pursed my lips for a moment. On paper, Joey was the one in charge, and it was entirely his decision to make. But we operated under a slightly more informal set of rules than standard group troops. It might be his call in the end, but Joey wasn't one to ignore input from his team. Our medic, Andy, spoke up first. "I say we keep going. Trying to navigate this terrain is tough enough as is. Doing it in the dark is just suicidal." I nodded in agreement. While our night vision made it possible to see in the dark, they also completely ruined any sense of depth perception. It would be all too easy to take a wrong step and tumble off the side of the mountain. Carlos seemed to share the same opinion. "I'm with Andy and Dave. That mess was bad enough when we came in. I don't want to be looking for some nuke when we're stumbling around out there." In the end, we all reached the same conclusion. Push on and try to complete the mission, even if that meant doing it in daylight. Joey nodded. "All right, let's get a move on then. Dave, you're on point." He gestured to me. The landscape glowed with a faint gold tint as the sun finally crested over the horizon. Taking advantage of the long shadows cast by the trees around us, we moved through the forest while surveying the slopes on either side, searching for anything that seemed out of place. Easier said than done. Al-Qaeda and other insurgent groups were experts at hiding camps and gun emplacements in these mountains, invisible until it was too late. Short of thermal optics from drones or planes overhead, they could be nearly impossible to spot, and the going was getting rougher. Loose shell rocks crumbled underfoot, making each step treacherous. It didn't take long for my own luck to run dry. I took a step and felt the rocks slipping out from under my boot, shooting my arm out to reach for a tree branch, but there was nothing there, just empty space. I cursed under my breath and tried regaining my footing to no avail. One foot slipped, then the other, and then I was skidding down the slope. I tumbled once, thankfully landing on my pack with an oof as the air was driven from my lungs, frantically trying to find some way to stop my descent. And finally, I found it. My arms wrapped around a thin pine sapling, and I dug my heels in, grimacing as the spindly tree bent and bowed, but thankfully held. Taking a few deep breaths, I finally hoisted myself back up onto my knees, checking my body and equipment for any damage. Aside from some minor scrapes, everything appeared in order. "Damn, you good, dude?" Joey suddenly appeared to my side, reaching out to grab my hand. But as I sat up to take it, he froze, eyes wide and mouth hanging open, staring at something over my shoulder. I turned and very nearly lost my footing again, heart leaping into my throat and adrenaline shooting through my veins like ice. Lying beneath a small rock outcropping not 5 feet from where I stopped was a man, clad in traditional Afghan dress and very obviously dead. Blood spatter coated the rocks around him, from what I could only assume were the wounds he had suffered leading to his death. The left side of his skull had been caved in, the eyeball hanging loosely and dangling against his cheek. His jaw was twisted and snapped in an unnatural angle, and 3 of his ribs jutted through the fabric of his winter jacket, soaking the beige fabric in crimson. I winced at the sight and took a step back, suddenly realized I'd raised my rifle and had it trained on his forehead. I lowered it and let out a breath. Christ. Andy moved up, poking the corpse a few times to ensure the man was well and truly dead. "It doesn't look like he was shot," he mumbled, turning the body over and holding up an AK-47 that had been pinned underneath it. Pulling out the magazine, he scowled. "Empty. Who's walking around out here with an empty rifle?" "Nobody smart," one of our machine gunners, Thomas, piped up. "Think he fell, Doc? Maybe busted himself up hitting all these trees and rocks and stuff." Andy began rummaging through the man's pockets, finding nothing more than a canteen. "Maybe. it would make sense given the injuries. I've seen it before. I summoned my nerve and leaned forward, pointing. If he fell, I asked, then what the hell did that? Turning the body over onto its side, Andy swore at the sight of a gaping wound on the side of the man's neck. A ragged hole almost the size of a baseball that went all the way down to his spine. He paused for a moment, letting the corpse slump back into place. Could have been a coyote or a big cat or something that found him after he fell. Decided they wanted a snack. Stay focused, guys. It doesn't matter whatever took a chunk out of him. We've still got a job to do. Joey brought us all back to the moment. Let's move. We set off again, taking more careful steps this time. But some small part of my mind wouldn't stay quiet, even as I tried focusing on the mission. I knew predators. If they found that corpse, they wouldn't have just taken a single bite. The body would have been ravaged, and there hadn't been any other obvious bite marks. I forced those thoughts aside and got myself back into the game. The mountains beginning to wake with the chirping of birds and the soft howl of the wind. Much to my relief, the terrain began to level out slightly as we moved into a ridge running around the mountain, though it was still rough going. Using the trees to pull ourselves along and steady our pace, we had to pause more than once as the altitude and strenuous marching punched our lungs and legs. It was almost 9 in the morning as Joey called for us to stop for another fiver. I found a spot to conceal myself in between 2 bushes, drinking deep from one of my canteens. And that was when the first shots broke the morning quiet. They were fairly distant, just muffled pops and cracks, but we all reached for our rifles and hurried into a perimeter peeking out of the forest. No one spoke as the gunfire continued in the distance, fading from a constant roar to just a few scattered shots here and there in the span of 30 seconds. And then silence. For another minute, we simply laid there, waiting for more, wondering if the next ones would rip over our heads, but none came. Carlos reached up to Key's radio. TOC, Viper 3, we've got gunfire near our position. Do you have any air assets in the area that might be able to take a look? The reply came a few moments later. Viper 3, TOC, there's a negative on air. They're all tied up. Are you in contact? Joey grumbled before keying up again. Negative TOC. Sounded like it was about a click away, not in our direction. Copy that, Viper 3. Stay safe. TOC out. Well, a lot of help that was, Carlos grinned. Damn Air Force can't even spare one of their fancy drones to help us see what we're walking into. What, like you're surprised? Joey offered him a rare grin, clapping the larger man on his shoulder as he stood. Come on, let's get moving. Eyes up. The next hour passed, much like the last few had, quiet and still, save for the occasional gust of biting wind or the chattering of forest animals. We didn't hear any more shots, though we kept our weapons at the ready and paused every few moments to stop and listen for any signs of danger that might be coming our way. We began to ascend the ridge, turned into a long sloping valley leading up towards the side of the mountain, ending a few hundred feet below the summit. I tried not to let out an audible groan at the thought of climbing up that monster of a hill, but that complaint vanished as Joey suddenly held up his fist, taking a knee. See that? He said, pointing up toward the top of the valley. I squinted, reaching into my vest for a small set of binoculars and putting them to my eyes. There, clear as day, was the entrance to a cave. It was small, a little more than a black speck against the rocks and snow, but there nonetheless. But that wasn't what made my heart skip a beat. Nestled between 2 large boulders near it sat a sandbagged machine gun nest, barrel pointed towards the sky. I frantically scanned the surrounding rocks and trees for any sign of enemy fighters. There was nothing. Joey took the binoculars to look for himself. Now that's weird, he murmured, glaring up at the cave entrance. These guys aren't the sort to leave a machine gun post exposed like that, and unmanned too. Any other day, we would have been getting lit up by now. I nodded. Taliban and Al-Qaeda fighters were experts in camouflage and often used scouts to signal when we were coming within range of their guns. To find a machine gun completely unmanned and exposed was definitely not in the norm. So, what's the game plan? I asked, scanning the hillside. For a moment, Joey sat in silence, glaring back at the rest of the squad before standing up. Let's at least go check it out. If nothing's there, we can always mark this place with the flyboys to drop a bomb later. Make sure they can't use it again. We began the arduous task of ascending the steep valley up towards the precipice, huffing for each breath and nearly having to crawl on hands and knees at some point. It was slow, painful going, all of us hoping to reach the top before we passed out from exhaustion. The entire squad froze as Joey halted and lifted his hand before pointing off to a stand of trees about 50 yards ahead, a tuft of fabric sticking out from between the tree trunks, something wet coating the ground underneath it. I swallowed, lifting my rifle and starting to advance along with him. We closed the distance, and a few moments later, the squad was kneeling in a semicircle pattern around the object with looks of grim fascination. Another body, even more disfigured than the last. One of the man's arms had been ripped or sheared off at the shoulder, his abdomen torn open as though he'd lost an argument with an angry lawnmower. Meat and bone lay exposed to the cold mountain air, blood coating the rocks around him in wide swaths. I tried to block out the look of abject terror frozen on his face as I leaned down to pick up the rifle at his feet. The barrel bent almost 90 degrees like it had been twisted in a vice. "Empty," I murmured, holding up the magazine. "Okay, what the hell?" Thomas cursed, hefting his M240. "Something ain't right here. This is weird." Joey and I exchanged glances, and for the first time since I'd known him, I saw something strange in his eyes. It wasn't fear, it wasn't hesitation. It was confusion. Like he just couldn't put the pieces together and figure out what was going on. He took a few slow, deep breaths before stepping back from the corpse. "Let's keep moving," he said, voice barely above a whisper. We found more bodies the higher we ascended, scattered among the trees and rocks. Some looked as though they'd been in a car wreck, twisted and mangled in unnatural ways. Others were almost ripped apart, long slashes carved through their flesh or missing limbs. We found one implanted on a tree branch nearly 20 feet off the ground. His blood was still dripping as we passed underneath. For the first time, I began to hear the tinkling of shell casings underneath my feet. Hundreds of them littering the ground near empty rifles and machine guns. Some of the weapons had been almost totally destroyed, barrels twisted or receivers crushed like a tin can. I'd faced death plenty of times. Friends had bled to death in my arms. I'd watched men be vaporized in IED blasts. I'd seen the life drained from men's faces after I'd shot them, and seen what was left after bombs fell on their heads. I'd felt fear, of course, when bullets snapped by my ear or a mortar landed just a bit too close. But this was different. There, in that valley, I felt terror. Something, deep down, in my most basic of instincts, was screaming at me to turn and run and never look back. This was a place of death, and I didn't belong. But I forced those thoughts aside. The rest of the team was counting on me to do my job, and I expected the same from them. We finally reached the machine gun nest, having passed at least a dozen disfigured bodies on the way up. I found the gunner himself, at least what was left of him, sprawled out in the snow behind the sandbags. He'd been torn almost completely in two. I suppressed the urge to gag and spun around as a voice called out, "Joey, we got a live one." Andy was gesturing frantically as he disappeared behind an improvised hut, nothing more than some tin propped up against a large boulder. We all rushed over to find him kneeling next to a man, whimpering and crying, blood dripping down his chin while he tried to hold in his guts, which had spilled into his lap from a massive hole in his abdomen. "Aaron!" Joey waved his hand, taking a knee next to the dying man. Aaron was our translator, and a good one. All the dialects in this area differed, but he had figured it out. Jogging up to the scene, Aaron took a moment to gather himself before shuffling forward. He spoke softly, resting a hand on the man's shoulder. They talked in hushed tones, the insurgent occasionally raising a shaking arm to point to the cave entrance. I could see the light starting to leave his eyes. I'd seen it plenty of times before. His words became softer and softer as his eyes shut, melting into incoherent murmurs before he slumped over, letting out one final breath. "What did he say? Did you ask him about the plutonium?" Joey asked, eyes hard as stone. Aaron stood slowly. He was from Texas, with a bright smile and a seemingly perpetual tan, but at that moment he was as white as the snow around us. Blinking a few times and shaking his head to clear it. He cleared his throat, suddenly staring intently at the cave entrance just a few paces away. It was no bigger than the door on a conventional refrigerator, but the inky blackness inside might as well have been a portal into another dimension. He said that they brought the plutonium here to make a bomb. We all bristled, visibly tensing, but he said it wasn't to use on us. What? That doesn't make any damn sense. Thomas glanced down at the dead man, eyes wide. Aaron continued. He said that the tribal elders warned everyone about this place, to stay away, but his commander didn't listen. They wanted this mountain as a scouting position and decided to set up camp here. They were going to use the caves to hide from us. And that's when... He said that's when they... woke it. It? What's it? Joey scowled, breath fogging in the cold air. He said... Okay, here's the thing. Some of these tribes up here, they've been around a long time. Like, a really long time. We're talking people who fought Alexander the Great, and they've got stories that go all the way back to before religion, before written language, before all of that. And some of these people believe that these mountains are sacred, and that there's something in them that wants to keep it that way. And when these guys showed up to set up camp, Aaron gestured to the scene of carnage around us. It got angry. Though it only lasted a few seconds, the silence that fell seemed to last for hours. It was Joey who spoke first. We've still got a mission. There's a crapload of plutonium inside that cave somewhere. He pointed at the gap in the rocks, and we've got to find it. So we're just going to ignore the whole thing about some mountain spirit messing up these guys and go in there anyway? Thomas asked, gesturing to the dead man at our feet. I mean this with all the kindness of my heart, Joey, but that sounds like a stupid idea. Look, we can't say for certain what killed these guys, Joey growled. For all we know, they ran into some opposing force, got ambushed, whatever. And frankly, I'm not going to stake this entire mission and a potential nuclear attack on the ramblings of a guy who was knocking on death's door. You all know, as well as I do, that some of these people are superstitious as hell. We've got a job to do, and we're going to do it. I need 4 guys with me. The rest of you pull security. In the end, there were no more arguments. Aaron, Andy, Carlos and myself volunteered to go in. I checked my rifle one more time, making certain that there was a round in the pipe before flipping my NODs down and following Joey into the cave. My heart pounded like a jackhammer, and the sweat felt like a cold hand on the back of my neck as we walked into the darkness, using the infrared illuminators on our rifles in conjunction with the night vision to light our way. Whereas outside, the wind and cool air helped to dampen the stench of death, inside the cave, it was almost overpowering. I almost gagged, trying to breathe through my mouth, but the cloying odour forced its way to my nose and throat regardless. I moved in single file down the narrow path, deeper and deeper, walking at a half crouch to stop from banging our heads on the low ceiling. Our beams of infrared light, only visible through the night vision goggles, lit up the path ahead. It didn't take long to find the first bodies, at least what was left of them. Most just scraps of cloth and streaks of gore staining the walls. Occasionally, we found part of a torso or a head, maybe some arms and legs. More than once, I almost slipped in a pile of viscera and had to catch myself, taking in lungfuls of the damp, putrid air. The corridor slowly began to widen until we were standing in a circular cavern with 2 more pathways forking off to either side. My heart sank with the thought of having to split the team, very much aware of the horror movie trope that we were walking into. That was until Joey tapped my shoulder, shining his IR beam on a wooden crate tucked behind one wall. Even with a grainy view of my night vision goggles, it's hard to miss a giant radiation warning symbol painted in bright yellow. I cautiously approached the box, slinging my rifle and taking off my pack. I could hear Joey and Carlos starting to set demolition charges to blow this place once we were finished. The hinges on the box creaked as I slowly opened it and winced at the sound, staring at the contents inside. A metallic sphere, maybe as large as a grapefruit, nestled snugly inside a bed of foam. Despite its uses, plutonium is actually perfectly safe to handle, even with your bare hands. The particles it emits won't even penetrate your skin. It only becomes truly dangerous if you inhale or ingest the material, or, put it inside a nuclear bomb. But that didn't mean I was just going to throw it in my pocket and call it a day. Fishing around inside my pack, I produced a finely woven cloth bag to keep any potential dust or particulate contained. Slipping it inside the pouch and then stuffing the whole thing into my pack, I stood and turned, suddenly feeling as though my feet had been nailed to the floor. I had seen a lot of arguably terrible things during my time in the teams. Men blown to pieces, soldiers screaming for their mothers as they died, an enemy combatant charging at me with a bayonet intending to ram it into my stomach. You never get used to it, but some part of your brain starts learning how to handle that sensation of overwhelming fear and terror, how to push it aside and keep going in the moment, leaving that as yet another suitcase of emotional baggage to handle later on. But out of all the things I witnessed, there wasn't anything that could have prepared me for what met my gaze. My brain just short-circuited, refusing to accept what I was seeing as reality. I blinked once, then twice. That thing was still there. And that's the only way I can think to describe it. A thing. Not a man, not a beast, but something in between. Shaggy, matted fur hung from its hunched shoulders as it crouched on all fours, unnaturally long limbs bent at odd angles. I could just barely make out the glint of foot-long, hooked claws, clattering softly against the stone every time it shifted its weight. Had it stood on all fours, it would have been at least 10 feet tall, though it sat hunched with all 4 of its freakishly long arms and legs. Some distant part of my brain realized that it wasn't breathing. Whenever it stopped, it stood perfectly still, not even the subtle rise and fall of breath. But all of that paled in comparison to the thing's face. There was nothing there, just an empty black void in the vague shape of a skull, or maybe a beak, or some awful creation of hellish sort. But there was one thing I could see for certain. Row after row of teeth, glistening in the dark, dripping something onto the floor below it. I don't know how long I stood there, but finally something snapped me out of my mind-searing reverie. It was Joey, hissing under his breath at me, one hand holding up his rifle to keep it levelled at the thing, the other clutching the detonation switch for the explosives they'd already laid. He dared not move, only flicking his eyes towards the corridor from where we came. I wanted to scream at him. Are you insane? But that seemed like a terrible idea, considering the circumstances. However, it seemed like our only option, and so I took a single step, my boots squelching on what I could only assume to have once been part of someone's digestive tract, now just a smear of gore on the rock. The reaction was instantaneous. The creature braced itself against the wall with a series of jerky, snapping motions and let out a sound that will haunt me forever. It was the sound of 1,000 men dying at once, a shriek that reverberated and echoed through the small chamber in wave after wave of pure hatred and contempt. I screamed in return, terror floating through my veins like shards of ice. We were all screaming, but our voices may as well have been flecks of sand in a hurricane, drowned into nothingness by that roar. I'm still not sure who shot first. I think Joey did, but it's hard to say. In a space that small, the gunfire should have been simply overwhelming, but I never heard it. I saw the flash from his muzzle spewing fire, soon joined by the other 3, lighting up the cavern like a flashbang. And yet that thing seemed as if it were made of living shadow, cloaked in darkness save for its savage teeth. Carlos was yelling at me to run, to get out, reaching over to grab my arm. He was snatched out of the air as his fingers touched my sleeve. I never saw that creature move, but suddenly there it was, one set of claws hoisting him up by the throat, and the other speared him through the abdomen, under his vest and coming through the back with a spray of blood. Carlos let out a low keening noise, shaking and squirming and trying to bring up his rifle as the thing lifted him off the floor. He never got the chance. He was ripped in two, his legs slamming against one wall as the rest of him hit the other side with a wet slap. I had just enough sanity left to flip the selector switch to fully automatic, bringing up my rifle and letting off a long burst as that creature lunged forward, swinging one of its appendages in a long sweeping arc. Aaron never stood a chance, collapsing to the floor as his head tumbled away. Andy only caught a glancing blow, but that was more than enough. One of those whistling claws caught him in the throat, the momentum from the impact hurling him into the wall with a sickening crunch of bones, shattering. Whatever coherent thought I had left evaporated. I was screaming, emptying the last of my magazine and starting to reach for another. The thing turned to face Joey and I, teeth gnashing and bloody claws scraping the floor. Once again it pounced, right as I slammed the magazine home and hit the bolt release. A burst of my rounds hit it right in the face, or at least where its face should have been. Sparks flew as bullets ricocheted off its teeth, closing in right on top of me. I was expecting the burning agony of claws sinking into my stomach, or a sudden light-headed sensation as my head was separated from my shoulders. But instead, I was knocked back off my feet, something heavy crashing into my chest. I skidded backwards, blinking away the sweat and blood stinging my eyes. Joey was lying crumpled against the wall, his vest torn away to reveal the 4 ragged holes in his abdomen where his ribs were peeking through. He gasped and sputtered for breath, blood forming a fine mist every time he coughed. The beast had turned at him and circled around for yet another strike. It looked between both of us, teeth clicking like iron nails on granite. Joey looked up from the ruin that was his torso, head bobbing back and forth. He still clutched his rifle in one hand, trying to bring it to bear. Our eyes met, only a few feet apart. Wheezing and gurgling, he lifted his left hand. The detonator was still in his grasp, and he flicked off the safety catch. He couldn't speak, his throat filling with blood, but he managed to mouth one word. Go. I wasn't even aware that I'd begun to run until I was halfway down the corridor, the sound of gunfire roaring in my ears as Joey emptied the last of his magazine in one long burst. There was a second of deafening silence, louder than anything I could have imagined, and then a noise like a clap of thunder inside my own head. It was all around me, inside me, pushing and pulling on every fibre of my body. Something was shoving me out of the cave and towards daylight. Yet again, some distant corner of my mind realised it was the pressure wave from the blast, and it might very well kill me, but I couldn't process that. All I could feel was Joey's hand on my back, pushing me forward, screaming, "Go, go, go!" Whatever it was threw me at least a few feet out of the cave and into the searing light of day, landing with a thud and rolling the last few feet. Rocks and debris rained down on my head, and all I could do was curl into a ball and wait for it to end, choking on lungfuls of dust and sand. Pain had become my master in that moment. Everything hurt. I could barely breathe. My head was screaming. All I knew was the searing ache shooting through every nerve ending in my body. Time slowed down, or sped up. I'm not really sure. Adrenaline and shock are funny like that. But eventually, reality began to take shape again, like I was crawling my way out of the mud and back into dry land. Only when I felt something grabbing me did I truly come back all the way, kicking and punching and yelling, frantically reaching for my pistol in my belt. I was going to die with an empty magazine and blood on my hands. Thomas slapped me. Hard enough to make my vision blur and my whole body go numb for a few seconds. Hard enough to finally pull me out of my stupor, blinking away the dust in my eyes and seeing his face staring at me from above. Eyes wide and mouth agape. He was saying something, but I couldn't hear him. Only the pounding of my heart and the rush of blood through my veins. He pointed frantically towards the cave and managed to roll onto my side, fully expecting to see that thing crawling out and come kill us all. Instead, I was met with a beautiful and terrible sight. A pile of rubble now stood where the entrance had once been, clouds of dust and smoke still rising between the stones. Forcing myself to my knees, I stared slack-jawed and wide-eyed, simply unable to process the sight, and I stayed like that for what felt like hours, simply kneeling in the shattered rocks and trying to understand. It was only when Thomas grabbed my shoulder and shook me that I found enough cognizance to scrape myself together. "We're getting out," he was saying. "Extraction is on the way." The first sound I heard as my hearing returned was the distant thrum of helicopter blades as we made our way out of the canyon. I was joined by the ever-present, never-ending moaning of the wind, carrying the sounds of dead men along the mountain tops. You'll probably never read the official debrief on Operation Condor. It's classified, and probably will be for the next 20 years. Of course, the military put out a press release which was even more watered down. It would tell you that Aaron Andy, Carlos and Joey died during the gunfight in a Taliban cave system in northeast Afghanistan. They were all posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Medal. We were all sworn to secrecy, of course. Most of the guys were happy to agree. They all wanted to forget. I did too. But I can't. They know something happened in that cave, something horrific, but they don't know the truth, and I don't want them to. Nobody else needs that burden. I left the military as soon as my contract was up, and that's why I'm telling this story now. Those government spooks and secret agents are going to do whatever it is they do to keep this under wraps, but somebody has to tell this story, and it may as well be me, because the truth has to come out. There's a lot of things to be afraid of in Afghanistan, but one of them is unlike anything we've ever seen. When I was a kid, I never really knew my grandfather Carl. Not only was he an ocean away, living in his home country while I grew up in America, he had died a few years before I was born, nixing any chance of a meet-up. Grandma kept his house and things locked away for a long while, until she too finally kicked the bucket about 6 years ago. We managed to get a little money that they had set aside, but more important than that was all the old stuff collected over the years. You see, Grandpa was a fighter through and through. He'd spent a good portion of his adult life as a soldier in both World War I and II, fighting for Germany, collecting a few medals to his name. My mum told me he never liked to talk about it though. Said he always had this vacant, depressed look in his eyes, even when she was a little girl. There was more than one time she would get up in the middle of the night for a cup of water, only to see him sprawled on the living room couch, a bottle in one hand and a weeping face cradled by the other. I could only imagine what he went through. Until now. Like millions of other people in the current circumstances, I found myself stuck at home without a whole lot to do, waiting for college to reopen and life to get back on track. With so many people comparing the current pandemic to past ones, the Spanish flu getting name-dropped the most, it got me wondering how my grandfather dealt with it. So I went up into the attic to go through some of his old things for some kind of clue, not really expecting to find anything. Pouring through old files and documents, I came across a battered envelope, unmarked. Opening it up revealed a handwritten note. I still retain enough German from my mother and school lessons to read some of it, so I started without asking for help. The contents of the note were far different from anything I expected. When I finished it, I didn't know if I should have got someone to make sure I had read it right. Queasily, I took it upon myself to be the sole translator, for I do not know how others would feel, and would not like to be publicly associated with its contents. Thus, I share it here with you folks, in the hopes that someone can make sense of this insanity, and perhaps someone else out there could tell me whether or not they've heard of something like this before. It read, "The first time I remember dying was in the fields of Flanders in September of 1917. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My life was unremarkable before my time in the army. My family used to own a little farm out in the countryside where we grew wheat and potatoes, toiling for hours a day to scrape by. When I was about 9, our father sold the farm and we moved into an apartment in the city where we took up work in snarling, pollution-ridden factories, melting steel or making textiles. Back in those days, even the small children were expected to work, so I went too. Sometimes I would have vivid, agonizing nightmares of heavy machinery searing my flesh to the bone or crushing my skull to a bloody pulp, instilling a terror to do my best and make no mistakes. Maybe that's where all this started. I don't know. When the war first broke out, I was 15 years old. In those days, there were few alive who had seen what war really meant. Most people only had vague notions of our crushing victory over France decades prior or of insurgencies in the African colonies. Quick, easy victories. When things stalled out, we were assured that the stalled situation was only a setback, even as this dragged on for years and as foodstuffs became more scarce from British blockades. I got called up from service a little after my 18th birthday, in August of 1917. Training was expedited, and in September I was shipped to the front of Flanders. Our train stopped at some French or Belgian town. We were shaken awake and then marched off to the front. We were sent in under the cover of darkness as artillery strikes in the daylight made things too risky. Immediately, I wanted to go back home. Within the first few hours, my ears were ringing painfully from all the artillery shells. Every time a flare shot into the night sky, I and the other new guys could see the long lines of dead and wounded getting carried out from behind the front-line trenches. Each time I got a peek, I wanted to vomit. In some way, though, the darkness was worse, because all you could hear were screaming agonized wails and unheard pleas to God. Our CO sent us to our different positions. I entered my assigned dugout with 3 or 4 others, where, by dim candlelight, we were face to face with aged veterans. One older man, thin and wrinkly, with jowls hanging down his cheeks, stared at us the same way a normal person would stare at a flea-ridden rat. "So, these are the newbies?" he said to us. A few hesitant affirmations, and the man averted his gaze and took a swig from his cup. "These kids are just dead weight." A stocky man, wide-shouldered and tall, with a big black beard hugging his face, stood up and said, "Don't mind Rudolph, he's been in since the very beginning. I'm Max." He shook all of our hands and gave us a quick rundown on what to expect out there. He was a kind, funny man, and we could tune out the drone of shells blowing chunks out of the landscape while he told us about how he used the box. I think he knew we weren't going to be able to get any sleep that night, even if some of us tried. We were all on edge, sitting around waiting for something to happen. In the afternoon, the shelling suddenly stopped in our area. Moving further behind the lines and giving our battered ears some respite, Max and the other veterans jerked their heads upwards, listening intently, the piercing sound of a simple order filling all of us with dread. "It's an attack. Assume defensive formation." We rushed out of our dugout and filed into our firing positions. I didn't think I had any adrenaline left to expend at that point, yet my racing pulse informed me otherwise. Some mortars were still going off all around us while we could see British troops, bug-sized at our distance, steaming towards us. Thousands of rifles all went off at once and machine guns rattled away. If my hearing wasn't damaged before, it certainly was now. Despite the firepower we could muster, the British advanced further on, which shook me to the core. I didn't think it would be possible to live through a barrage so deadly. What before appeared as cockroaches slowly crawling along the ground now looked like men, and they were starting to shoot back. I heard a couple people cry out in pain as bullets hit them, and out of the corner of my eyes, I saw a man collapse, dead. Frantically, I fired, worked the bolt, inserted more clips. The more I fired, the more I felt like I was doing something, even if I wasn't aiming near half the time. In a split second, I saw one of them toss something, and it landed right behind me. I spun around recklessly, seeing it only seconds before a white-hot flash enveloped me. Just enough time for my brain to think, grenade. And then I felt myself getting shaken awake again, back on the train. Startled, I jolted upright, blurting out, "Where am I? What kind of hospital?" I promptly shut up, taking in all my surroundings. It was the train car, all right, and everyone I had disembarked with. "The asylum's further down the tracks, buddy," someone joked, prompting some cruel chuckles. I had no idea what was happening. Touching my face and the rest of my body, I couldn't feel any wounds, so I reasoned the blast must have knocked me out somehow, but my head didn't hurt either. Had I been comatose? I pushed the whirlwind of confusion down into the back of my mind and dumbly proceeded as our COs told us. We marched again, went down the same trench again, and went to the same exact dugout. Rudolph was waiting for us just as before and recited word for word what he had said to us the first time. "So, these are the new kids," he said. Even though he was older and a veteran, I was still mad. How could he be so stupid as to not recognize me? "What are you talking about? I was with you just yesterday, I think. Nobody told me what happened." I spotted Max and pointed at him. "Max, you remember me, right? The farm boy. You told me about your days as a boxer." I stopped because everyone was looking at me with wide open eyes or cocked eyebrows. Max had practically turned white. He visibly swallowed, like there was something stuck in his throat. And he asked me, How do you know all this? Nervous energy sending waves of static through my body, I told him plainly. You told me all this before the attack in the afternoon. What the hell is this? What the hell are you trying to pull on us? Rudolph shouted, frantic movements sloshing the beer around his cup. Screw this, I'm getting out of here before you bring bad luck to me. He pushed his way past all of us, muttering about witchcraft and dark magic. Stunned, I slumped into a corner while everyone else just stared, like I was a filthy beggar trampling into a noble ballroom. All of us spent the night in relative silence. Just as before, we were ordered to take our positions in the afternoon. Everyone was spooked, especially me. Why was everything the exact same way? I couldn't dwell on such matters for long as the British came forward. I hammered away, once again, spraying lead into the air with reckless abandon. As before, I caught a split-second glimpse of a soldier tossing a grenade at my position. Having more awareness of the initial threat, I tossed myself to the side, but regrettably, it wasn't enough. After a deafening boom, I was thrown hard to the ground, rendered into bloody mulch scattered across the trench walls. Disoriented, I could also feel a stinging pain in my right arm and my stomach, shrapnel aggressively lodged in. As the chaotic sound of battle raged around me, I could only moan in pain, hoping that someone would take me out of my misery. I do not know how long I had laid there, my perception of time and space getting hazy from blood loss and agony, until mercifully the darkness enveloped me. And I ended up right back where I started, at the train again. If I hadn't been disturbed before, I certainly was now. When they shook me awake, I came up screaming and grabbed my rifle. "Calm down, boy, calm. You're not at the front yet," an officer said. With shaky hands, I lowered my rifle and slung it over my shoulder. "I'm sorry," I said. "I just had a nightmare, that's all." The officer walked away, shaking his head. No doubt they all thought I was crazy. It certainly felt like it the more I went on, going down the same exact path to the same dugout I'd been to twice now, to meet the same people I'd already met. "So, these are the new kids?" Rudolph said. This time I kept my mouth shut while the other new guys nodded their heads. He took a drink from his cup and said, "These kids are just dead weight." Right on cue, Max got up saying, "Don't mind Rudolph, he's been in since the very beginning. I'm Max," I finished. "You're Max, and you used to box back in Cherbourg. I know." I felt everyone's eyes on me again, but no longer cared. Frustrated after having such a horrible death, I turned towards Rudolph and angrily told him, "I'm not a damn witch, you old prune, so don't even think about pulling that with me again." While everyone else was visibly shocked, Rudolph's face turned beet red and his grip over the cup tightened. "You don't get to talk to me that way," he shouted, getting out of his chair and spilling his beer in the process. He made a beeline towards me, but was stopped just in time by Max. The larger man held the skinnier one back, while the former tried to temper the latter's rage. I just stared right back into Rudolph's mean, peaty brown eyes with silent contempt. Eventually, he settled down, and Max turned to me, a bit angry himself. "Listen," he said to me, "I don't know what's going on here, but whatever it is, you've got no right mouthing off like that." Max pulled up a chair and crossed his meaty arms. "Tell us what the problem is," he said. I obliged. I went through everything as best I could, trying not to miss any important details, while Max stared me down, stoic. The others, sans Rudolph, who sulked with a new cup of beer, staring in wide-eyed wonder. When I finished, Max let out a long sigh and asked, "So, why is this happening to you?" "I don't know," I said, exasperated. "I've never gone through anything like this before. It only started after I came to the front." "Goddamn gypsy curse, I tell you," Rudolph sneered. "Those buggers collect grudges the same way little kids collect bottle caps or tin men. I bet you or yours did something to tick one of them off, and now you're screwed." He finished his cup, then got up to leave. "Well," Max said, "can you think of any strangers you might have aggrieved, or has anyone in your family done something?" "I can't think of anything," I said, deflated. "Oh God, I don't want to keep going through this. I don't want to get my legs ripped off again." My legs trembled at the thought, and I struggled to keep my breathing under control. Max stood up and grabbed my shoulders with his huge hands. "Hey now, don't think like that," he said, continuing with, "The more panicked you get, the more likely you are to make mistakes, and the more likely you are to die." And so he told me a few things he'd already taught before my first death, about taking cover and taking carefully placed shots. I listened as intently as I could, mentally went over it until it was all I could think of. The other new guys listened to him too, and a couple of the older guys there supplied their own knowledge. By the afternoon's attack, I took everything he said to heart. With newfound resolve, I found my nerves cooled, my aim steady. Everything I touched felt more real. The air smelled sharper, the sounds of the dead, injured, explosives and gunfire just background noise. Despite my second wind, the British managed to reach our trench anyway. A man to my right was crouched over, about to jump in, when, without skipping a beat, I shot him in the hip. He half groaned, half screamed when he fell in ungracefully. Without thinking, I ran over to him and slammed the business end of my boot into his face until I was satisfied he'd been subdued. Unfortunately, my victory was short-lived, as another Brit had climbed in behind me in the melee, and I felt a bullet painfully tear its way from my back to my chest. I fell against the trench wall in pain, just in time for a second bullet to hit me. And so went a third life on that day. But when I returned to this earth again, I didn't lose my composure or my resolve, as I had before. This time, I knew for a fact that the course of events could be changed, that even if, by some cosmic force of nature I didn't understand, had stacked the deck against me, there was still a potential way out, and I was determined to find it. This time, upon entering the dugout, I chose not to reveal my secret, and instead presented an infallible facade that had the rest of them convinced that there wasn't anything troubling or unusual about me. I even decided to hold out my hand for that cantankerous asshole Rudolph, which he reluctantly shook. Events proceeded along the same lines as they had before. I successfully picked off several of them before they started to stream in like usual. One of them had pounced on a young man, Lars, who had come in with me off the train. The Brit was older and sturdier than the skinny Lars, the latter bleeding from a cut on his head while the former punched the kid's face over and over. In a split second, I got off one shot at the Brit, hitting him on the side of the face and eviscerating his head in a slurry of brain matter. Lars looked at me in appreciation, only for his eyes to widen with shock and for him to quickly point off to my side. I twisted my head around and saw another Brit who had jumped in, readying his rifle against me, but determined not to keep reliving the same day forever, and slammed the butt of my Gavir right into the other man's face, hitting him at least twice more before eyeing the top of the trench again, anticipating another one coming in. Instead, a half-dazed, walking wounded Brit stumbled in from another part of our trench and jabbed his knife into my left arm. Crying out in agony, I battered the enemy on the head with my rifle stock, which he grabbed. Withdrawing the knife from my arm, the red-black inner liquid dripped down the blade and onto my uniform as the Brit shoved me against the wall and directed the knife towards my face. Before the man could fillet me, Lars shot him in the back. I threw the Brit to the ground, where he simply laid there, breathing laboured, then turned and nodded to Lars. Just then, the reserve unit started to pour into the trench, providing us with reinforcements. Near immediately, the British raid collapsed in our sector. An officer took one look at us and told us to go get some medical treatment behind the lines. While the two of us waited in the procession of screaming, bloodied men, Lars spoke up. "I want to say thank you for saving me back there. I should have been more careful." "Don't mention it," I told him. We're new here. I think we should just be grateful to still be alive." As soon as that last part slipped out, I had a smile from ear to ear. I had made it. My fate was not inevitable after all. "Do you drink, Lars?" I asked, still a bit lightheaded with jubilance. He shook his head no, and I said, "Well, you do now. Where's Max? I'm going to buy everyone a drink tonight to commemorate our survival. From here on out, we enjoy every moment like it's our last." Lars's face turned pale, and he opened his mouth but closed it quickly, biting down on his lower lip. What's the matter?" I asked. A sinking feeling rolled around in my gut, and my prior joy was fully torpedoed when Lars spoke next. "Max is dead," he said. When I just stood there, glued to the ground in horror, he went on. "Some British guy threw a grenade into our section. He got killed. Some of the shrapnel gave me a head wound." Chewing on his bottom lip again, He offered a small apology while my mind just stayed blank. Our wounds weren't serious compared to so many others, so we got stitched and bandaged and sent back the same day. Sitting in the corner of a dugout, I stared at the ground in incomprehension. The man who had done more to keep me alive than anything else was gone, and I was on my own. I got up to grab some rations to eat when my gewehr fell to the ground. I'd accidentally dropped it. I stared at the rifle for a good few minutes. I could go back, I thought to myself. I could save him. I grabbed the rifle in both hands, removed the bayonet from the top, and placed the barrel against my forehead. It was just then that Lars came back from getting his own food. He shouted, "No, don't!" which caused the others inside who hadn't noticed what I was doing to look over. They grabbed me just before I could reach the trigger. "Wait, you don't understand," I pleaded. "I have to go back." For hours they sat there, restraining me, and all I could do was weep. They did let me go eventually, to rest, and I was only allowed my weapon back after repeated assurances that I wasn't going to try anything like that again. I lied, of course, and when I found a much more suitable spot to die alone, I took the opportunity. But rather than finding myself back in the train car where my journey had started, I re-woke back in the area I'd slept last, on a mattress in our dugout, watched over by one of our guys who had volunteered to watch me. That put an end to my suicidal inclinations, at least for the time being. But the idea that I could make sure things go their proper course was too alluring to be disregarded. Whenever we went on an offensive or counter-offensive, I'd purposely die several times in a row in order to get a proper feel for the layout, then chart a course of progress that went through the path of least resistance. I was always the one to find the thinnest section of wire, the least guarded section of the enemy's trench. I could tell where all the snipers and machine gun nests were in perfect accuracy. Defensive operations were different. The trick that took me a long while to learn was to always let events proceed in a very specific way. If I changed my behaviour too much, then the enemy soldiers would change their behaviour in turn. However, if I stuck to a rigid pattern and retraced my steps exactly, then the enemy would never deviate too much. With time and patience, I got good at leading them into ambushes like chess pieces. Every time I saved a man from a sniper's bullet, or perfectly predicted when artillery or mortar shell would land, people took notice. Rumours were whispered in the night that I had an angel watching over me, and by extension the rest of them. Men who I had seen die or get maimed in one of my prior lives would come up to me and jokingly ask if they were going to make it. Try as I might though, casualties were inevitable, and despite my best efforts, I could not save everyone. It was haunting. At some point or another, someone in the higher-ups must have noticed my actions on the battlefield, because once the worst of the fighting around Ypres had stopped, I was selected to become a Sturmtruppen. It was a mixed blessing, as, while I could more readily utilise my ability in their ranks, I'd have to go through even more lives and expose myself to greater danger than ever before. It was easier to forget how much I'd endured when fighting was happening, because I could disconnect from it, feeling perfectly hollow and empty. In the spring of 1918, the trepidation I held within me was finally realised. We were to go on the offensive, with our Sturmtruppen naturally taking the lead. My unit, still stationed in Flanders, took to offensive operations in April. At first, we did stunningly well. I hadn't even needed to throw many lives away in the first few days, maybe only 2 or 3 in total, and only to perfect our already good margin of victory. It felt like we could take the whole world, but the more the offensive continued, the more I realised something was going wrong. We kept outrunning our supply lines, having to wait for the rest of the army to catch up with us. The British kept regrouping every time we had to go through a delay, and it was starting to show. Resistance to our attacks only increased more and more, and our Sturmtruppen were the ones who had to deal with it. One day, my friend at the time, Volker, prodded me awake. "Carl," he said, "we've got the order to move up again. Grab everything." I'd only managed to get a couple hours worth of sleep, having decided to take a nap in between assaults, so upon getting up, I was still exhausted. My limbs felt heavy, my mind was foggy and scattershot, my eyes were dried out and stung. With all this weighing me down more than my equipment, I advanced. Immediately, things went bad. Running straight through the battlefield as I usually did in order to cover as much ground as I could and memorise the layout quicker failed, as each and every time I was riddled with bullets. I decided to take a more measured approach in subsequent attempts. My comrades and I had to approach at a snail's pace and keep our heads down every step of the way. It felt like the British were throwing all they could at us. Even crawling around like a rat had its difficulties though. I noticed that no matter how far I managed to crawl, I would still get shot. The first couple times I thought I was the victim of an unlucky ricochet, but I kept getting killed even after some slight changes to my advance, so I deduced that my adversary was a sniper. Reasoning that I was never going to get ahead with that rat hunting us every step of the way, I subjected myself through multiple deaths in order to find his position. It was no wonder he kept getting us. His nest was hundreds of meters away in a half-destroyed brick house flanking our entire company. I sprayed bullets in his general direction with my Bergman MP18, but it was certainly no long-range tool, even in the best of times, and with my body weak and my mind impatient and on edge, it was certainly not the best of times. After about 3 deaths foolishly focusing on taking out the sniper, I settled for an occasional burst of gunfire in his general direction to keep him suppressed, but that still left the wall of British guns firing at us. My exhausted mind couldn't focus on the sniper and the frontline trench at the same time, and I died multiple times to both. Impatience was giving way to rage, and I ended up stupidly getting myself killed many times after trying to rush things. In one death, I'd screamed curses at our adversaries and wildly shooting in their general direction, then took a bullet to the spine and fell face first into a puddle instead of a shell hole. Unable to move my limbs, my lungs filled with muddy water, burning in incredible pain before I died. When I came to again, my anger broke and gave way to pure fear. I started to wonder if I would ever be able to escape this madness, or I would be doomed to cycle through lives endlessly. Halfway into my next attempt, I hid inside of a shell hole and found myself unable to move. The fear had paralyzed me utterly. Volker arrived at my side and tried to snap me out of what looked like the onset of shell shock. "Carl, come on," he said, grabbing me by the shoulders and shaking me. "We're getting shredded out there. We need you now more than ever." With real desperation in his voice, he said softly, "You can't break down now. Please, Carl." That's about when the mortars started hitting us. I hadn't experienced them until now, as I died too soon in each case. One went off close enough to catch us both. My vision went blank, and I felt waves of pure agony rolling over me. When I did not come back to the spot of my nap, and the pain did not subdue, I came to the horrified conclusion that my face had been blown off by the bomb. Indeed, I found that I couldn't work my mouth anymore. Instead, feeling pain like thousands of glass shards were stuck in me, while my tongue tasted the sickening copper taste of blood. I could feel that my right arm still worked, so I retrieved a grenade from my pouch to kill myself with. My left arm was horribly mangled, and my fingers wouldn't work, so I held the grenade down with my left arm while the right pulled the string. After successfully killing myself this way, I threw up the minute I woke up. Volker was concerned, asking, "Are you sure you're good to keep going?" "Yes," I assured. "I just ate something bad. It'll pass. I'm good to go. Come on." Sighing, the older man pressed his hand against my head to make sure I wasn't feverish, and upon confirming that I wasn't, we rejoined the others and prepared for our assault. Shamefully, I abandoned my unit when the mortars came down around us again. As I dashed back into our own lines and the perceived safety it would bring, a mortar tossed me into the air. I fell on my arms, which produced an unholy crunching sound indicating a fracture. As I pushed myself up to continue running, I felt a pulse of pain jolt through my right leg. A piece of shrapnel had got stuck in there below the knee. I limped the way back and collapsed in front of fellow Germans, all begging for help. When I came to next, groggily, I noticed I was in an actual bed, and to my sides were others in mutilated conditions occupying beds of their own. I was in the hospital. I breathed a sigh of both relief and sorrow. I had failed my friends and abandoned my duty, but at least I would be able to live. I later learned from one of the nurses that out of 67 of us, only 14, all wounded, survived the failed assault. Volker had died too, and I grieved for him while damning my own cowardice. Indeed, failure hung over the air in a dusty cloud. While I loafed around, listening to the wails of those less fortunate than I learned how to walk with crutches. My leg wound would never fully heal. We heard story after story about offensives stalling out, then getting pushed back. Correspondence with my family turned sour as well when I learned my youngest brother, Edmund, and my father had both died from an outbreak of influenza. My oldest brother, Fritz, was working tirelessly every day in the factories to support our aging mother, and I could do nothing from my hospital bed. When the war ended in our bitter defeat and I was discharged from the hospital, I left for home right away and started looking for work. But with everyone else demobilizing and our country in political and economic chaos, it was not easy. For my part, I took to drinking heavily. There were times where I would wake up after a night of slamming back as many whiskies as I could take, only to realize that it was still yesterday and I died from choking on my own vomit. Out of intense self-loathing, there were times where I stuck my head in a self-made noose and died, forlornly hoping that one day I'd stop coming back from death. One day during the early 20s, when I was busy trying to kill my liver at the local tavern, a couple of Reds stormed in. "Comrades," they shouted, "we are looking for revolutionary volunteers for the KPD." They went around passing out flyers for the Communist Party and repeating far-left phrases to anyone willing to listen. Finally, they came over to me, and one of them tried to slip a flyer under my elbow. "Workers' literature, comrade," I remember him saying. I grabbed the flyer and crumbled it into a ball, tossing it behind me. The Red took offense to the gesture and said, "If you're a reactionary type, then maybe it's best you get out of town. We don't need another boot heel over the necks of the workers." Rage cooked my body into an inferno, and impulsively I said to him, "Maybe it's you who should get out of town. If it wasn't for lazy, entitled dicks like you, maybe we would have won the war." I gave my money to the tavern keeper for the liquors I had drunk and shoved past the Reds, disgusted. "Hey!" they shouted at me. I was halfway down the street before one of them grabbed me by the shoulder. Before I could tell them off again, I felt a brick slam into my cheek. I felt teeth come loose and blood run down my throat. I was assailed with clubs, fists, kicks when I fell to the floor. After my head was bludgeoned a few more times, I came to in my bed. My rage from before had turned to pure wrath. To murder me over something as petty as politics, it defied belief. I wanted revenge. Instead of drinking myself into a stupor, I waited in an alley outside the tavern and waited with a knife in hand. When I saw the two Reds coming down, I pounced. I stuck the first one in the stomach and sliced him open. He had just enough time to look at me in wide-eyed shock before he spluttered to the ground. Clutching his intestines. His partner turned and ran, but I followed. Even though my leg protested vehemently at the strain, I caught up to him, tackling him to the ground and pressing my knees into his back. I slammed the knife into his neck over and over again. He died gurgling on the crimson tides that flowed from his injury. When I stood up, I looked around, dazed. It's not every day that one commits murder in broad daylight. I looked to my left to see a grinning man on the sidewalk. He came up to me, gently took the knife from my hands, and just as gently pressed a flyer of his own into my hands. "Get out of here before someone sees you," he said, and just like that, he walked away. Fearing prosecution for the murder of two Reds, I ran away, fast as I could, back home. Hours later, after frantically trying to wash off all the bloodstains from my clothes, I took a look at the flyer the bystander had handed me. It contained a picture of a blonde-haired man, clad in a brown shirt uniform, holding up a red flag, with a white circle in the middle that held a black shape. Not long after that, I started going to the rallies instead of drinking myself stupid. Fritz and I drifted apart. All I wanted was a confirmation that the torturous deaths I went through and the comrades I failed to save along the way, despite my gift or curse, were not for nothing. And when they started winning elections and annexing neighbours without a shot fired, I felt vindicated. I was part of the Uzatsia Reserve Army when the Second War began, training others and carrying out administrative tasks on the home front. As things dragged on and millions were swallowed up in the fighting, we all wondered which of us would be next. When I received orders to go to Italy, I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach. I was stationed in what was supposed to be a quiet sector, leading a small company of men in an Italian backwater hamlet. We were third-rate replacements for people sent to more pressing fronts, and I knew it. Locals stared at us with daggers in their eyes and hate in their hearts. Discipline among the men was poor. Everyone knew the war would be ending soon. So many took to drinking, oogling women and what have you. It was under these conditions that a private went missing. After a 15-minute search, we found his body covered in bruises and stabbed dozens of times, dumped in a ditch like garbage. After I heard the news, I excused myself, found a quiet spot from prying eyes, and blew my brains out. When I came to again, I frantically shouted to the men to do a head count. They didn't understand my urgency until they noticed the missing man. Just as frantically, I had them run to the spot where I found him last. Unfortunately, he was still dead. A cauldron of anger bubbled inside me. I was done losing people needlessly. As was standard procedure back then, we took hostages, 23 in all, and demanded that the partisans who killed our man reveal themselves. When none came out, we filled the screaming, crying, begging hostages with lead. When it was all over and I had the chance to calm, my throat tasted bitter, and I felt self-contempt. I ramped up security and instilled a sense of discipline into the men under my command. The tit-for-tat with the local partisans continued, and so did our hostage taken. We must have killed well over 100 from our reprisals. My insides felt like they were churning knives, so I started taking to the bottle again. I had to dull the pain. Things were getting terrible going to 1945. The partisans had become bolder than ever, and the skies were dominated by American planes. One night I couldn't sleep well and decided to get through some paperwork via candlelight. An hour and a half later, I heard frenzied shouting and gunfire. Grabbing my coat and sidearm, I dashed out there, asking anyone who could hear what was happening. Partisans, I was told. There must be dozens of them. I tried my best to lead a proper defense, but events were chaotic in the darkness. A bullet hit me in the stomach, and I dropped to the ground in agony. A familiar dance. Returning to this mortal coil, I remembered which direction the partisans struck us from. Accordingly, I had a platoon set up well-hidden firing positions and booby traps. When the wannabe freedom fighters came into the kill box, they didn't know what hit them. Some were killed running into our traps, but most were simply shot. They were routed without a single casualty on our side. When it was over and we inspected the battlefield, we counted 12 bodies and 8 prisoners, 5 of whom were injured. Darkly energized by victory, I had all the prisoners stripped naked. The wounded ones, those too crippled to walk, were doused with water and we left them to freeze. That left 6. We took them to the cellar of some farmer's house and we interrogated them. We wanted names, locations, everything. They spat in our faces and called us names: fascist pigs, butchers, sons of whores. We unleashed our hatred upon those young men, whipping them raw, burning their skin with hot iron pokers, and gave out old-fashioned beatings with fists, clubs and boots. We had them executed the next morning, hung to death. God, it makes me sick now, thinking about it. The last partisan attack I went through, a sniper shot me right in the ribcage. I ended up having to go to an actual hospital to get the bullet out. When I was sent back, the war was in its last months. The company I led was a shadow of its former strength, at only 44 men, and we were getting put near the front. Artillery hit us everywhere. There were no German cannons left to contest them. Likewise, American planes flew unimpeded, bombing and strafing whenever they liked. Under these conditions, one of our soldiers tried to desert. We captured him though, and the men asked me what should be done. At this stage, desertion could be punishable by summary execution, and after having put myself through hell to make sure everyone got back home safely, this man's attempted desertion felt like a slap to the face. Despite my anger, I couldn't bring myself to punish him. I knew all too well what it was like to lose one's cool under fire, and showed mercy to the poor man. Had my more fanatical superiors found out, it could have meant my job, but I was prepared to take the risk. I felt as though that moment made me realize that there was a way of making sure those under my command could come home. When Americans advanced in our position and demanded our surrender, I had the men disarm. Not long after the war ended, and we slowly got repatriated back to Germany. There was occupation, rebuilding, restructuring. The post-war years for me felt unreal at first. I feared, constantly, that the next war was right around the corner, that I'd relive yet more deaths again. And when West Berlin was blockaded and the Korean War broke out, I felt like I was counting down the seconds. But it never came. In 54, when things looked calmer, I decided that I could not live in fear forever. I married, had a child, raised a family, and though I always had fear of a new conflict, I didn't let it dominate my life. I do often think about my gift, or curse, or whatever you want to call it. Looking back at my life, I wonder if perhaps there was some higher purpose that I was supposed to fulfill that I did not, or if it was supposed to function as penance of a sort. I researched precognition through the interwar years and after, but records of anyone with quite the same experiences as me are scarce, much less a meaning to it all. Here, at age 92, with a Germany now reunited, I have hope for peace in future generations. And, while I can't say for certain, I have a feeling that the next death will be my last. There's so much I can't tell you, which makes it hard for me to begin. I can't tell you the place, other than it's a desert in the US far from any city. I can't tell you my job, other than I'm a soldier. Have been since Marty Mulhone stole my lunch money in the 3rd grade. He went home with a black eye. I went home for a week. I joined up at 18, blew through basic and threw in fatigues for 3 tours in deserts far from the one I'm stationed at now. I've seen a lot of things. IEDs take legs and arms and souls. A little girl catch a stray bullet, go down with her head trailing ribbons of brain like gruesome streamers. I've never seen anything like the flesh pit. My superiors are probably reading this. I'm sure they'll have it scrubbed from the internet long before it's breached the stratosphere. Not that it matters to me. I'll be dead by the time it's over. I'm going to end myself. It's not the answer. Suicide never is. But I want to be in control of my death. You'll understand why soon enough. It's growing. Even as I write this now, it's inching its way towards the taxpayers we're supposed to protect. But we can't protect them from this. Not the flesh pit. We don't know what it is, where it came from. We don't know how to destroy it. Not yet, anyway. We only know that it grows, that it eats. It's a massive sinkhole in the desert crust, a fleshy, gaping mouth expanding every day, minute, second. It's miles wide now. Wasn't that big when I first got here? It was no bigger than a swimming pool, its fleshy walls caving down into a deep, sunken cavity that bubbled, shifted, moved like melted cheese in a simmering pot. Looking at it made my stomach curl with nausea. But the smell. I've known the scent of brain matter blackened by gunpowder, of disemboweled guts cooking in the desert pan after an ID chewed a Humvee to scrap. This was worse. A damp, rotten reek that tunneled up your nose, down your lungs and settled into your chest, nesting there like a dead thing in the walls of the house. A smell that usurps all others, lingering even when you've left the flesh bit behind. You'll never smell anything else again. I've been here for 5 days, got here 2 days after it was discovered. By then, checkpoints were scattered around its circumference. Sandbags, tanks, coils of concertina wire 4 men high. Overnight, that was all gone, including the 24 seasoned grunts stationed around the perimeter. The flesh pit had taken Uncle Sam's sanctioned guns and assimilated them into its living walls. No one knows how it happened. They only know that by morning it was the size of a football field. It was growing faster than we could blink, ever expanding, eating away at the cracked desert skin, turning it into a shifting layer of flesh. Higher-ups wanted it contained, needed it contained, destroyed preferably. It was only a matter of time before the media circus fell out of their clown cars and projected this living nightmare to the outside world. That was where I entered stage right. Sort of. Like I said, I can't say much more than I already have. They'll know who posted this. But it's not for my safety. It's for yours. The less you know, the better. which means you shouldn't go poking around for the SEA. That's the Supernatural Enforcement Agency. I'm only telling you for the sake of context. Other than that, you do best to sit on what you already know. Let the media talking heads do their dirty work. It's their job after all. You might be wondering how I got involved with the SEA. It's simple. I'd seen things overseas. The usual horrors of war. Death, torture, ruin. But I'd seen other things too. Dealt with them in a way that promoted me to an acronym agency after I'd finished my tours. That was how I found myself in the SEA. Not to say I wore a tie and aviators smoked over my eyes. I still wore a uniform, with medals. Made me seem important, which I guess is true. I was, after all, the one they brought in when a perfect town, the one that lived on no maps, went up in flames, and when the ocean devoured a seaman on a mission down a ladder. If I do die, which I suspect I will, you'll be hearing more from me. I have a dead man's switch, one set to release my tales to the ether. Because, despite the flesh pit being the worst of the horrors, there's other things you deserve to know about, to be prepared for, if nothing else. The siren sounded at midnight. It cracked the darkness in half. A keening cry that sent 400 armed soldiers flitting out of barracks and into formation, all of them jittering, some with nerves, others fear, with the knowledge that the screaming siren meant one thing. The flesh pit was here. The impressive maze of mobile buildings, tents and watchtowers that comprised Base Camp Alpha and sat behind a chain-link fence 3 miles south of the flesh pit was alive with activity. CPOs screamed orders to their men, magazines were pumped into rifles, a wall of guns fell into place along the chain-link fence, sighted out onto the desert beyond. Or what used to be the desert. I wasn't there to give orders, but if I was, I would have called a full-scale retreat. What else could we do? As I took my place atop the foremost watchtower, anchored guns on either side of me, their belt magazines coiled up like steampunk snakes, I saw the desert was gone. In its place stood a sunken, shifting concave that radiated terrible heat and piped that awful, fetid reek. The flesh pit had melted away the desert sands. The flesh pit was all I saw to the horizon and back. Floodlights clicked on along the fence, lancing bars of cold brightness out across the 50 feet desert separating us from death. The flesh pit had gotten deeper. I could tell by the way darkness spilled out of its center, like it had punctured Mother Earth's heart, and blood that looked like a shadow was fountaining out as she died. Should I call this in? I hesitated, took a beat. My thoughts solidified before they formed. Up until now, I'd merely dealt with the aftermath of disaster, not the catalyst of it. It made it hard to think. It made it hard to... An arm shot up over the rim of the flesh pit, grasping for purchase. It pulled out a body, one of which looked like a man, and moved like a man who'd forgotten how to walk. It found its footing on flat ground, took an uneven step, then another, staggering forward like a zombie in an old black and white picture. As soldiers called it out, I watched it slowly get the hang of movement, its footing becoming more certain, powerful, like its atrophied muscles were solidifying with strength. "Permission to fire," the gunner beside me called into his headset, finger nuzzling the trigger of his mounted LMG. A garbled voice came back, and his finger left the trigger with a pang of disappointment. I watched the thing approached, a lurching silhouette moving just beyond the range of light, quickly nearing the fence line separating us from it. A nearby mounted loudspeaker aimed at the pit came to life with a squeal. "Identify yourself," a hollow, angry voice roared out. The figure continued forward, moving like a marionette in the hands of an unskilled puppeteer. I squinted. Then it stepped into the light and a bolt of horror slugged me through the center like a clenched fist. "Jesus Christ," the gunner beside me hissed. "Jesus." The man who moved like a broken toy was made of nothing but flesh. Faceless, featureless, a twisted parody of a human being, one cast in melted, waxy meat and given life by something alien and awful. A voice filtered through the gunner's headset, and his finger found the trigger once more. I plugged my ears as gunfire split the night in two. A spray of bullets cut the fleshman apart. His top half fell forward with a heavy smack, bubbling out across what remained of the desert ground like liquid meat. But he didn't stop. His bottom half kept moving, picking up pace, breaking into a heavy sprint toward the fence line. As his pale feet, each hairless, nailless, trampled through the puddle of goo, it sucked up into his form like a sponge. His top half regrew as he took an impossible, leaping stride toward the fence. He impacted it with a metal clang and skittered up, more arms sprouting from his form, turning him into a flesh spider as it cut up through the razor wire. Barbs tore scraps of bleeding meat from its body, but it didn't stop. It fell over the fence and onto the knot of soldiers below, tearing through them as gunfire erupted and chaos fell over Base Camp Alpha. My hand found my sidearm as I watched the flesh pit. I could feel something brewing deep within it. It vibrated up through the soles of my feet, shaking my lungs and teeth above them. An army of things filtered up over the rim, flooding out like a chasm of ants fleeing a drowning hive. Hundreds of fleshmen, flesh things, rushed the fence line like an army of meat. Tanks of skin drove up over the lip and fell forward, charging towards us and blowing meaty globs of liquid goo into the light. It assimilates and copies, I thought as my world broke like a vase dropped from 6 stories. It's John Carpenter's The Thing. Then I fell down the tower stairs and ran like hell. The night was a disco of gunfire and blood. Grenades went off left and right. Sprays of desert pan flew up on fireballs, riding them like geysers of heat. The fence light folded like paper as the army of meat drove through it. Flesh things, spiders, dogs, men, tore through the ranks, vaporizing soldiers, engulfing them in bubbling meat and turning them against mankind. Gunfire rattled through the air as screaming troopers fell back, fell away from the fence line and the expanding flesh pit. I belted down a row of tents, past the young man with his service pistol tucked up against his mind. He squeezed the trigger and dropped like a sack of flour, his thoughts and feelings spraying out in a gory fountain. I ran towards my digs, ran for all I was worth, my breath whip-sawing, legs pumping and aching, and something swept into view ahead of me, and I stumbled to a halt. My heart was beating against the walls of my ribs, beating and desperate to get out. My stomach knotted up as I stared at the thing blocking my egress. It was 15 feet high, a juggernaut of raw muscle, its head like the top of a tank, a massive meat barrel jutting out from a hexagonal slab of flesh. Its thick, grubby hands curled up into meaty fists. Every muscle on its incredible form strained out, going tense as it readied its artillery to blow me away in a burning gob of flesh. It's going to turn me into a fleshman, I mused as I stuck my pistol under my chin. Screw that, I had time to think, before I squeezed the trigger. Click. The safety saved me from blowing out my brains, which was good, because the instant I fingered the trigger, the tank man erupted in a burning welter of flesh. Hot ribbons of meat exploded pell-mell as a grenade went off by its feet, taking him down in a fiery flash. All at once, the screams and cries and tattoos of gunfire was replaced by a deep ringing, like a bell buried deep within my mind had been struck by a sledgehammer. I watched with mounting horror as the splattered remains of the tankman bubbled and reformed, growing into a dozen creatures on either side of me. I found my strength and staggered back, desperate to be away from. Hands grabbed me from behind, pulling me off down the alley of tents. I looked up. A soldier looked back. A human one, face painted in blood and grime and resolve. He said something to me, something I didn't hear over the din of tinnitus the grenade had left echoing through my head. "What?" I cried. He pointed forward as we stumbled along. just ahead, I saw a black beast lift off into the sky. A helicopter, its mounted machine gun spitting fire at the earth below. There were two others still anchored to the ground beneath it, their rotors whipping up walls of dust as they prepared to lift off, to leave the nightmare behind. The soldier, whose name I never learned, shoved me into the Black Hawk, my ears still singing and now wet with what could only be blood. He clambered in behind me, shouldering off his M4 carbine as the ground pulled away from us. He socketed the gun to his arm and began firing off tight bursts into knots of flesh things shredding through the ground below. I watched like a person in a movie theater, my screen, the small sliding door etched through the belly of the chopper. I watched as desperate men screamed and waved, begging us to return. I watched as they were devoured by flesh things raging through Base Camp Alpha like a plague. I saw crackles of light as guns went off in futile protest of the war against humanity. Clusters of flames burned bright, sending flocks of sparks floating up into the midnight sky. Men died, bled, screamed. As we drew further away from the earth, I saw that nearly half of the camp was gone, crumpled down into the sunken, living pit of flesh. I sat that way with my ears ringing and my head pounding and watched Base Camp Alpha shrink into the distance. Nothing but the flesh pit behind it as far as the eye could see. And I knew, as I know now, that it would never stop growing, eating. It won't stop until it's replaced the whole world with an ocean of meat. I'm in the wind. I'm sure I'll be dead by tomorrow, but I need to let people know this thing is loose. I'm an agent with the United States government, and my station is Black Site 7. I won't tell you my name. It would probably be useless to you, but this was not how I saw my life going. I spent 6 years in Iraq, signed up right after high school, and it was nothing like the recruiter told me it would be. I spent 8 years in the blistering heat, hauled my fair share of comrades out of firefights, and saw a lot of hell over there that would make normal people go crazier than I might be. I've had camel spiders crawl on me while I sleep, watched friends I've known since basic get decapitated through binoculars, burned houses full of insurgents and civilians to rubble, and when I was done, they gave me my papers, thanked me for my service, and sent me home. I know I have no right to complain. Many guys didn't make it back, but home was worse. I'd spent the last 8 years in an active combat zone, and now I was just supposed to come home and go back to civilian life. I spent 3 months home, 2 of those months spent in a crappy apartment because my parents couldn't handle the night terrors and the jumpy marine that had come back before I knew it wasn't going to work. Every car horn, every barking dog, every firework rattling in the street had me reaching for my gun and breaking into a sweat when I couldn't find it. Before TJ found me, I was considering suicide. Then one day, he's just at my door with a big cheesy grin he'd always worn. "You look like hell, House. Let's get some pancakes. I've got something I want to discuss with you." TJ was my platoon leader in the sandbox. They called him the comedian because he was always smiling, always cracking jokes. He was a functional sociopath. I guess most of us were, but I always admired his ability to laugh in the face of such messed up stuff. TJ was not his real name, but since he's still in the mess that I've left behind, I figure the best I can do is not remind them that he's why I'm here. He took me out to breakfast, and in the back of a crowded Denny's, he laid it all out for me. "You've got it bad, House," he said through a mouthful of pancakes, "but that's okay, because good old Uncle TJ has the cure for you. I've got a new job, familiar work that might interest you. Ever hear of 2 Trees? I had. 2 Trees was a government institution that, on the surface, did a lot of medical research and clinical trials. Underneath, though, they did wet work, and anyone who was involved in covert ops knew about 2 Trees. We'd worked with them a few times in Iraq, and their guys were spooky, to say the least. "You're looking at the new head of Black Site 7. I furrowed my brow at him. Congratulations? Should I know what that is? Of course not. It's a closely guarded government secret, and 2 Trees is paying me a small fortune to keep it that way too. Problem is, I need someone to curate the site for me. Someone with military training, experience with firearms, and a need for some normalcy. Know anyone like that? I knew what he was asking, but I didn't think I was who he was looking for. I hadn't found work in the 3 months I've been back, and most of that was because I couldn't settle into anything. I was constantly jumpy, constantly on edge, and that makes it hard to find work. No one wants you doing security or minding a gas station when every backfiring car was an enemy combatant. What would happen if I had an episode in a government facility? I shook my head. Thanks, but no thanks. I don't think I'm fit for duty the way I am. Yeah, I thought you might say that, he said, putting a metal tin in front of me. Your medical files read like a benchmark for PTSD, night terrors, irritability, being on edge, those irrational bouts of anger that got you thrown out of your parents' house, he added with a little smirk. I felt defensive. How do you know about that? You'll be surprised what my level of clearance will get you. Your therapist records are about as hard to get as a beer at a gas station. Well, I've got a little present for your house. Welcome to the rest of your life, he said, indicating the silver case. The case was as big as an Altoids tin. There were no markings, filigree, or needless ornament, and a distinctly surgical look. I slid my hand toward it, but it didn't seem to want to touch it. Every sense I had told me to walk away now, not to touch it and just walk away from this unassuming little case. I forced my hand to pop it open instead. Inside was a pair of pale, grey gel caps. What are these? These are the answers to your prayer. 2 of these a day will make you feel as calm and clear as you did when you were a mere lad of 18. No more jumping at every noise, no more reaching for your gun when a dog barks or a car backfires. Just peace of mind. I imagine now that this is what Mephistopheles sounded like when he spoke to Faust. What's the catch? These pills are only available through the 2 Trees Corporation. Employees who agree to be part of the clinical trial get them free of charge, but they're only available to employees, he said with a little grin. Take them, take a day to feel the effects, and let me know what you think. Call me tomorrow and give me your answer. Enjoy a night of freedom. Then make a decision. I took the pills home with me, and after a few hours of staring at them, I took them with some vodka. The effects were instantaneous. If you've never had PTSD, then it's hard to explain, but it's like having a loose wire that someone fixes and then you go back to the way you were. My anxiety melted away, my fear dissipated, my unease and dread were gone, and my anger seemed like a distant memory. I was sitting in my crappy apartment, surrounded by the trappings of my depression and my anxiety, and suddenly I felt like I had before I boarded the bus in 2003 and headed out to basic training. I was finally comfortable in my own head, and it was like coming back to a comfortable place after years of running from danger. After the first good night's sleep I'd had since shipping out, I called TJ and told him I was in. One question, I asked. What's in the pills that make them work so well? He was silent for a long minute before saying, You really don't want to know, House. Pack your stuff. There'll be a truck to move you to West Virginia in the morning. And that's how I came to work at Black Site 7. I must have looked like a junkie by the time I pulled up in front of my new home. I didn't have much. The truck had taken all 4 boxes into the deep woods as I followed in my old compact. The journey was about 16 hours, and by the time I got there, I started to feel the anxiety creep back in. I became angry at how slow the truck was going, afraid that this whole thing was a trick so they could kill me, and found myself wanting to die when I saw TJ standing at the gates of what looked like an old military checkpoint. He flashed that knowing smile and handed me another silver case. I dry swallowed the pills without a word and felt the inner peace worming back across my brain. Then he showed me to my quarters. It was a little bunk room with a bunk bed, a kitchenette and lockers for clothes. There was a footlocker for my personal stuff, and I was told to keep the space clean. I would be responsible for the site and its security. He showed me a little terminal off the bedroom with monitors and camera feeds. The compound had cameras all over the place, but I appeared to be the only person actually there. The site is mostly for storage these days. but it's what we get up to here at night that may interest you. That's why you're here. I need someone I can trust to watch the site 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. 4 times a year, you'll be relieved for a week of R&R somewhere, but other than that, this is your new world. That didn't bother me. I had no problem being alone, but I was curious to what I was doing out here. What am I looking for exactly? TJ pointed at 3 buildings on the camera. Keep nosy people out of there. Lethal force is authorized. And don't ever go in there, or I'll have to show you where Black Site 8 is. He said it with a smile, but the smile didn't cross his eyes. Don't worry about being vigilant though. If anything bigger than a mouse moves out there, the alarms will let you know about it. He told me that my food will be delivered once a week, mostly MREs, and I could order anything I wanted from the terminal in the living quarter. There was a workout yard near the second building, and I could move through the woods if I chose, as long as I took my phone with me so I could get alerts from the console. By the way, hand me your phone, he said, and when I did, he put it in his pocket and handed me another one. That's your new phone. I'll take the keys to your car too and put the money from it in your account. This is your life now, House. Don't take this job lightly. If you leave the grounds, we'll know. If you try to update social media or try to tell anything on the outside about what you've seen here, we'll know. If you want to marry or feel like you need out, arrangements can be made after your first 5-year tour. As far as anyone is concerned, you no longer exist. Don't be stupid. Put in your 5 years and we'll reassess your position. He grinned again and punched me in the arm. And lighten up. This will be the easiest 5 years of your life. From that point on, I was an employee of 2 trees. TJ had been right though. The first 5 years flew by. I lived in the site, spending my days working out or watching TV, playing the latest video games and watching the newest movies, and guarding this black site in the middle of the woods. I never tried to get into the warehouses. I had been a soldier long enough to know to check my curiosity, and the scares were minimal. The food kept coming, the pills that kept me in my right mind kept coming, and it was pretty peaceful all told. The alarms, to my knowledge, only went off 3 times in that first year, and 2 of those times it was a deer who had wandered too close. The first time it happened, I had slunked out in a panic, service pistol in hand and boxer shorts flapping. As I rounded the first warehouse and drew down on a very surprised doe who darted away before I could draw a bead on her. It was kind of a special moment for me. I had never seen a deer up close, and as it ran away, I was glad I hadn't shot it. The third time, it had been a person. The first person I had seen in 3 months. I had been sitting at the console one night, watching a Marvel movie, when the alarm went off. I paused the movie, expecting to see a deer or a bear in the monitor, but my eyes went wide when I realized it was a person. He had a crowbar, and he was attempting to pry open the door. He must have come out of the woods, because if he had driven up, I'd have known about him much sooner. It had been 3 months since I'd seen a person, not since Agent Doherty had come to relieve me for a week of R&R in September, and the idea of seeing a person not connected with 2 trees made me feel weird. Even when you're on R&R, you went to a company resort or a company place full of company people, so you didn't get a little too drunk and talk about all the stuff you did for your country. I took my pistol outside and crept up on him in near silence. When my foot came down on an extra crunchy stick, he turned his head and noticed me, raising the crowbar as if to attack. The gun went off without me having even spoken to him, reflex taking over and dropping the threat before it could become a real danger. His left eye popped like an overripe fruit, and he fell down on the hard December ground. I called TJ, and he had some other men in suits come and assess the damage. You did just right, House. He was a threat to the facility and needed to be put down. Don't think for a minute that this reflects poorly on you. What will you do with him? I asked. TJ smiled. Immediate disposal, House. Think you've got the stomach to help us? I found that I did, and once he was doused in gasoline, we set him ablaze on the edge of the property. They gave me an extra week of R&R, and when I came back, TJ decided that I was worthy of being brought in on certain things. The alarms went off a week after I came back, and I saw TJ stepping out of a black car and waving at me. I slid my shoulder holster on and went out to meet him. As I approached the vehicle, 2 other men in suits were bringing a man with a bag on his head out of the car. He was wearing scrubs, his hands bound behind his back, and I could hear him crying beneath the black hood he wore. I looked between them, waiting for an explanation, and TJ threw an arm around me and walked me towards the spot where we burned the trespasser. House, I think it's time we bring you in on the second reason for this black site. You see, sometimes 2 trees has assets that need to be eliminated. The black sites are often used for these purposes, but it's always the responsibility of the site's caretaker to carry out these eliminations. Why wasn't I told about this before? I asked, feeling indignant. I'm no murderer. Oh, well, those combatants in Iraq will be glad to hear that, won't they? He said, almost snidely. That was war, TJ. This is murder. Think of this as war too, House. These people are the enemy, and they need to be eliminated for the good of public safety. It's part of the job, House, a part I know firsthand that you're capable of. They put the man on his knees in the middle of the burnt spot, and he knelt, praying under the hood as we stood around him. Put him down, House. That's an order, TJ said. I looked at him icily. And if I won't? The 2 men with him drew their guns, and TJ grinned. Then I'm afraid that these men will have to execute both of you. Come on, House. Don't throw this away over some nobody. He's no different than the man outside the warehouse. I wish now that I'd just let them shoot me, but I guess if I had, you'd never know about any of this. Instead, I drew out my gun and put a bullet in his skull, glowering at TJ as his buddies put their guns away. You made the right choice, House. Who knows, you might not have to do this more than a dozen times in the next 4 years. I executed an asset a month after that. There were mostly people in scrubs, people in lab coats, doctors, researchers, people who had likely tried to steal from whatever facility they worked at. There were men and women, old men and scared 20-somethings. I never bothered to learn their names. They were just assets to be eliminated, and I became kind of numb to the process. We burned them afterward. Gasoline and fire made it like they were never there, and the spot near the edge had a charred look to it after a while. At the end of 5 years, TJ came to me and asked if I wanted to re-up. What happens if I walk away? I asked. I was eating dinner when he come by, and he sat down to have a plate of fettuccine with me. Given my free time, I had learned to do a good number of things I couldn't before. I became a pretty good cook, learned to play guitar, read every book on the shelf, and there was a chainsaw out back along with some sculptures I'd made with it. I couldn't say I hadn't enjoyed my time here, the killings aside, but I was curious to know if they'd actually let me leave. You'll be allowed to return to the real world, your bank account fuller and your retirement substantial. Just watch what you say out there. I'd hate to have to bring you back for your replacement to put a bullet in. I ended up signing up for another 5 years. I shouldn't have done that. I was 8 years deep when they brought the girl in the black bag to me. It was 2 a.m. and I started to think about bed when the alarm went off. I looked for TJ, but he was not the one who climbed out of the Blacktown car. This guy had his hair slicked back and his suit was an immaculate blue pinstripe. He did not wave at me, and I felt a sense of dread as I grabbed my gun. Somehow, I expected TJ to be under the bag this time. The man's name was Stein, and he didn't have TJ under the bag. What he did have was a kid with a thick black hood over their head. I couldn't tell at first if it was a girl or boy. They were dressed in baggy clothes, Salvation Army rags that a homeless guy would be embarrassed to wear, and they were crying loudly under their hood. 2 familiar men had the kid, and they looked stoic about the whole matter. Stein didn't say anything, just led the procession over to the charred spot and put the kid on their knees. When he made no move to remove the hood, I did it myself. He winced but didn't stop me. This was my place, my job, and I garnered a reputation for being a professional. A reputation I was about to ruin. The bag came off, and the little girl's tear-streaked face came into view in the harsh fluorescence. Her hair was cut short, dirty blonde and hacked to pieces, and her face was covered in bruises. Her nose looked broken, and her lip was split, the blood trickling like red tears. I sighed, looking at Stein as the gun stayed at the ready. "What the hell is this?" Stein looked surprised. "It's an asset. TJ said you handled these for us." "Handle the asset." "This is a kid, barely old enough to wipe her own ass. What could she have possibly done?" Stein's face was stony. "Yours is not the question, soldier. Liquidate this asset or be liquidated." I looked at the kid, her whole face shaking as the tears and blood fell, and thought about watching a head pop like a grape. This wasn't some scared adult, some stoic old man, some praying woman, or some cursing thing with shallow skin. This was a kid. I had killed many people, more in my time here than I ever had during the war, but I was still a professional, and professionals had standards. "No," I said. Stein blinked. "What?" "No, I won't kill a kid. Do it yourself." The two men drew their guns, and I was transported back to the first time. I was standing there, 2 days after Christmas, watching TJ grin and tell me the rules. Now I was standing in the woods, the autumn leaves carpeting the ground, feeling sure they would soon drink both my blood and the girl's. "I will give you till the count of 3 to kill the girl. After that point, you will both be executed. 1. Their guns were unwavering, but so was my resolve. 2. I closed my eyes, preparing to die. 3. I heard the sound like wet concrete splitting open. It was followed by a high-pitched scream and a pair of bodies hitting the ground. I opened my eyes and saw Stein running towards the town car, the two men who'd been holding me at gunpoint bleeding out on the ground from large grisly neck wounds. As I watched Stein run, a rust-red something snapped out and caught him in the back of the neck, dropping him inches from the town car. I looked back in the direction the thing had snapped out from, and saw that the girl was now a mass of red spikes, segmented like spiders. Her face had split long ways, forcing her face into a grisly sideways maw. The area between the teeth glowed deep red, and I could see the eyes of the girl's face blinking erratically, the two halves of a smile grinning at me. I figured for the second time that day that I was going to die, but she scuttled off into the woods instead, walking on a strange spider appendages as she crashed through the trees. I stood there for a few minutes, not quite sure I believed I wasn't dead, and then I started running too. I crashed through the woods for hours, running in no particular direction, sure that at any minute the creature or a helicopter from 2 trees would fall on me and either rip me apart or blow me away. I had blundered off with no wallet, no cell, just my gun and the clothes I'd been wearing. Was the phone how they tracked me? TJ hasn't said much, but maybe. When the ground went from under me, I felt the air drop out of my lungs. I fell 5 feet off a mud ledge and skinned my hand. My knees hurt where I landed on them, and I realized pretty quickly that I'd fallen onto a road. If I thought it might be an illusion, the headlights that pinned me to the ground a moment later left me with little doubt. Thankfully, the truck stopped, and after a short conversation with the driver, he offered to take me into town. That's how I came to be here, in this dingy hotel that just happens to have a computer in the lobby. Sold the gun for about $500, and I figure I'll disappear soon as I'm done writing this. They know I'm gone by now, but I don't know if they think I'm dead or if they think I fled. Either way, they'll find me, I'm sure. I'm more worried about that little girl that's loose in the woods and whatever it is that's living beneath the surface of her skin. If you see a young girl with short, dirty blonde hair, do not approach her. I don't know if she killed those men to get away or if she killed them because she wanted to, but she should be considered dangerous if you encounter her in the wild. And if a man from 2 trees offers you a job, do not become the curator for Black Site 7. The job is definitely not all it appears to be. The Deepwater Horizon was one of the biggest man-made disasters in the world, holding the infamous title for being the largest environmental disaster in the history of the US, ever since its fatal explosion in the Gulf of Mexico, 41 miles offshore from civilization. What they don't tell you is that the Deepwater Horizon, caught in one of the worst disasters the world has seen, wasn't the only one like many others recorded in the documents and files known to the press and public. For highly classified and non-disclosure agreements that I've signed, I am expected not to be revealing this publicly. Unfortunately for me, I do not have much time left in this world. Recently, I have been diagnosed with stage 3 lung cancer from specialists and doctors alike, with the excessive heavy smoking that I'd picked up as a stress reliever to get away from the memories and nightmares that had been plaguing me ever since that damn search and rescue operation to Watchtower 1. Speaking of which, Watchtower 1 wasn't the original name for the oil rig, as they had changed its name several times to avoid whistleblowers. As such, I, unfortunately, cannot disclose the true identity of the facility to avoid those who poke their noses into the operation that I had longed and yearned to forget. This is purely my recount and guilt reliever to get the weighing matters off my chest before I leave this godforsaken world for good. You see, on November 4th, 2018, I joined the CDC, also known as the Centers for Disease Control, with the mindset and pretext that I would be of aid in curing diseases, giving medical attention, and relaying medical supplies to those who are living in disease-ridden third world countries. For the first 2 years, that was the case. Paving my way through college and earning my biomedicine degree after the army, naturally, the CDC seemed like a good job offer to take up, with it being the apex of healthcare professions after my graduation. When they had accepted my job application, I was thrilled to say the least. Nonetheless, I would not be working for them as a standard health scientist, during which I was informed that a field in the CDC was lacking in manpower and workers, demanding that if I were to take up the job offer, I would be part of a security task force team specializing in crucial search and rescue missions and escort of personnel from the CDC and civilians alike. It wasn't the kind of work that I had in mind when I joined the CDC, but it was a high-paying job for a beginner like me at the time, so I just thought it seemed like a good job offer, with the encompassing fact that I had been training and serving in the military, so I was pretty well suited for the job. The third field assignment that I had received earlier came with skepticism, codename Operation Hammerdown. Alongside with my team of 5 personnel in total, consisting of 4 security officers and me, was supposed to receive a distress call coming from an offshore deepwater oil drilling rig, also known as Watchtower 1 in the Atlantic Ocean, to rescue and secure 2 geneticists and the rest of the rig personnel who were on board at the time of a seemingly aggressive encounter with an unresponsive mutilated figures coming on board the platform from the vessel that has been seen to have fatal injuries covering the entirety of their bodies, exhibiting rabid and hostile behavior in terms of jerky and shuffling motions towards the crew. Those who had tried to establish physical contact with the figures have been seen to also exhibit sudden violent and aggressive tendencies within a couple of minutes, and therefore have been quarantined and separated from the rest of the crew on board. The massive scientific research vessel had coincidentally crashed into the drilling rig during a hurricane-like storm in the sea at 2200 hours, and had gotten stuck and lodged into the pillars, as documents and recorded information about the call states. The distress call came in at around midnight, as the connection had abruptly halted from unknown reasons, possibly from the storm itself. Gearing up my issued equipment and loading a fresh magazine into the M4 carbine, I strapped and tightened the bulky black tinted gas mask around my face as I donned a heavy, yellow rubber hazmat suit with an accompanying tactical vest at the outside, strapping considerable lengths of heavy-duty duct tape around my wrists and legs and sealing them up to prevent air from entering and escaping. I exited the decontamination chamber, drenched in the cleansing water and the heavy downpour of the rain, as the roar of the Black Hawk helicopter greeted me as it resounded throughout the slippery landing pad, with occasional thunder that boomed in the distance. The rest of the security team waved to me, all clad in the same yellow protective suits, sitting in their respective seats. Upon boarding the helicopter, the ground crew outside gave the helicopter one last exterior check before giving an all-clear thumbs up to the pilot and co-pilot before shutting the metal door in a quick and swift slam, locking it into place. Torrents of raindrops the size of bullets pelted the top and sides of the helicopter vigorously, sounds of their impact drowned out by the blade of the helicopter as it gradually hovered above the ground before taking off. Call signs, background static, and garbled voices chattered over the communications radio built into a hazmat suit, as the shaky chopper ride to the oil rig was carried out mostly in silence, apart from the constant droning of the radio and the howl of the helicopter blades. I thought that our weapons would protect us. I thought that this mission was just a simple extraction operation. I was so wrong. Rudely stirred from my short power nap by the shrill announcement of the pilot implying our arrival, the helicopter shuddered against the force of the unrelenting downpour of rain. Stealing a glance at the electronic clock hanging on the wall of the helicopter, it read in brightly lit red numbers, 3:23 a.m. The exterior window of the helicopter was covered in a thick layer of water, as the world outside the helicopter was shrouded in vast, thick and black void, with nothing except the mesmerizing wave-stricken ocean as far as the eye could see through the dense curtain of rain. Vulture 2-2, platform coming into view, feet dry in 20 seconds, the pilot radioed. The surrounding void of darkness engulfing the sea gradually became brighter and brighter as a massive behemoth of a structure seemingly rising out of the sea came into view outside the blurry water-splattered window. We have a non-visual status on personnel in the rig. Break. The words came over the radio, slow and drawn out as the helicopter circled around the brightly lit drilling rig with a massive visible black reefer vessel half sunken and stuck into two of the platform pillars, causing it to slightly bend and tilt over to an unstable angle. My jaw hung agape as another unsettling image of the rig soon came into view, this time at the landing pad. The offshore helicopter, used to transport personnel from the shore to the rig, was seen sprawled flat on the landing pad, raked tail dangling over the edge, and the body of the rest of the helicopter torn to shreds with a chopper's blade hanging loosely at its sides. Scratches and damage could be seen visible on the wrecked metal bird laying on the pad, as giant violent waves slammed against the concrete pillars of the rig, causing the lights of the infrastructure to flicker each time from the impact. Copy that. Radio check, stand by. Switch to secure channel, over, the co-pilot radioed. The overhead door buzzer sounded as the interior of the helicopter lit up in a dazzling red light. Two of my squad mates, Corporal Jackson and Sergeant Volkers, stood from their seats with assault rifles strapped tightly to their vests as they simultaneously gripped the handles and heaved both of the adjacent doors open with grunts. Gusts of storm wind and rain whipped around in the interior as I and the rest of the task force prepared ourselves for insertion. Green light, go, go, go. Thick black fibre ropes dropped down from the top of both helicopter doors as Corporal Jackson and Sergeant Volkers were the first to grab onto the ropes and slide down. I followed suit after them as the rain violently pelted against my fogged-up gas mask, obstructing most of my view. Swiftly sliding down the rope as my boots slammed onto the metal platform, I quickly drew the M4 assault rifle and switched the safety off as I noticed my other two teammates who were already in position, assault rifles trained on a rusty metal steel door a couple of feet away. Sounds of sliding and boots hitting the wet ground could be heard behind me as the other two squad members, Corporal Staples and Specialist Maxian, rendezvoused with us, assault rifles crackling and clicking into place as the whole team filed into combat stance, weapons drawn at the ready. Whiskey 3, this is Vulture 2-2 at Bingo Fuel. We're bugging out of here for refuel and resupply. Godspeed. Over. The helicopter hovered above us for a second before rising up and circling the rig for another minute, before soon flying back into the distance, the sounds of turning blades quickly disappearing and masked by the incessant pitter-patter of rain and thunder. The surroundings around me were grimly lit by the overhead lights of the rig as a loud, stressed groan of the infrastructure echoed throughout its walls and floors. Sarge raised his hand and motioned for us to toggle the flashlights on our guns to operational as he took the lead and walked towards the metal door, with the rest of the team still vigilant and following after him. Approaching the worn-down and corroded metal door, we stepped aside and divided ourselves into two sections, each on either opposite sides of the door, and pressed against the grime-coated wall, awaiting further instructions. Breathing heavily through the fogged-up mask, I could still make out the palpable lingering smell of decay and decades of rusting metal as the platform squeaked noisily under our weight. Sergeant Volkers motioned the countdown with his gloved hand, mouthing the numbers whilst carrying his rifle in the other hand, as we mentally steeled ourselves for a breach into the facility. On my mark, 3, 2, 1, breach. The metal door flew forcefully open on its hinges with a slight dent in its body from Sergeant's leg kick as we noisily chambered through the doorways guns and eyes transfixed on the front as everyone piled into the small corridor, dimly lit with constant flickering of overhead lights. Room cleared. The small corridor, basked in yellow-green hue by the lighting, led to a metal-grated flight of stairs leading downwards as we cautiously stepped over the debris-strewn flooring, the sounds of constant dripping rainwater leaking from the metal walls fading into the background as I followed behind Sergeant Volkers, with the rest of the team trailing in a single file after us. Upon descending down the flight of stairs, we were instantly hit in the face with an unmistakable, strong, sickly metallic smell of blood, concentrated enough to permeate and filter through our gas masks, causing one of the team members trailing behind us, Specialist Maxian, to bend over and gag, as he used his assault rifle to leverage to keep himself from falling over. Jesus Christ, what in the world actually happened here? Specialist Maxian remarked through the radio, the distinctive sounds of his coughing mixed with the fuzz and the white static emitted through the speakers. Clenching the weapon tight in my hands, I shone the flashlight attached to the barrel of the gun onto an unlit section of the corridor, with the beam of the light falling upon a frame of a person dressed in a matching orange reflective taped jacket and pants lying against the wall. I momentarily stopped in my tracks as I stared in shock at the scene that lay in front of me, dread gripping tightly at my sides. Figure spotted, 11 o'clock, I briefly announced, stepping towards the figure, weapon still drawn and aiming down at it with a barrel flashlight. Advancing towards this person, I noticed that the surrounding walls and floors he was lying in were coated in a sickly crimson-red liquid, and the sickly smell of blood growing more and more concentrated, the lingering, oppressive feeling of dread growing densely in the pit of my stomach the closer I stepped, the sounds of my boots softly clanking against the floor. The rest of the team stuck behind, guns trained on the body. "Sir, are you alright?" I kneeled down and gripped his shoulders as I gently shook him, the rifle clutched in my other hand. No response. As I slowly tried to lift up his face, I held one gloved hand around his chin for better support as I repeated my question. "Sir, do you—" Oh my god. I recoiled backwards in disgust and terror, letting go from his chin as he limply slumped back forward, hordes of tiny, wriggling maggots and brownish red liquid dribbling out from his mouth and onto his lap as they wriggled about vigorously in protest to the beam of light that shone upon them. "What the hell? What the actual hell? What happened to him?" Corporal Staple said in disgust through the radio, his expression turning sour, eyes glued upon the dead body lying in the corridor. Sergeant Volkers exchanged glances with Specialist Maxian as he inspected the dead body, leaning in for a better look. "Poor guy seems to have died a long time ago, most likely one of the workers on board the rig," he said, bending over and picking up a small identification card that slung loosely around the worker's neck, examining it. "Let's get moving. We've got business to attend to." After a couple of minutes of making our way to the end of the dimly lit corridor, we came across another huge metal door, this time with an accompanying faded label which read "Cafeteria." I tried the greasy handle as the huge door remained wedged and locked tight. Suddenly, a shrill, feminine, ear-piercing scream and animalistic howls could be heard coming from the other side of the door as soon as I tried to jingle the handle for the second time. I flinched by instinct as the whole team jolted, weapons trained on the door. But as soon as the chilling screams and howls resonated through the corridor, it had stopped as quickly as it had started. "Hello? Miss? Please respond. We are here to help you," I shouted through the metal, holstering my weapon as I cupped my hands against the door to amplify my voice. My pleas for a verbal response came empty-handed as the muffled sounds of shuffling feet and slow metal scraping against the floor could be heard from the other side. "Damn, we've got to get to her. She might be injured," Corporal Jackson said beside me, stepping forward as he lifted the barrel of his rifle and aimed in the direction of the metal handle. Breach. 4 quick and loud gunshots rung out from the muzzle of his barrel as it illuminated the cramped corridor around us in dazzling bright yellow flashes as sparks flew from the handle itself. The heavy metal door swung wide open after 2 consecutive kicks, and we quickly filed into the pitch-black cafeteria through the doorway, breaths panting as the beams of light from our weapons shook around violently in our hurried states. As we fully composed ourselves and calmed down, the entire cafeteria became eerily quiet. Apart from the muffled thunder outside and our breathings through the masks, we scanned our flashlights around in the pitch black room in search of the source of the screams that came earlier. I was still breathing heavily through my mask, the steam from my breaths quickly blocking and quickly limiting my view from the eye holes. The whole room was deathly silent for a full minute, with nobody saying a word with bated breaths. We stood in our positions and used the narrow beams of our flashlights to scan around and illuminate the surroundings as light fell over a scene of broken tables, twisted metal chairs, and shattered coffee mugs. Suddenly, quick dozens of flashes of motion were caught in the corner of my vision as I jerked around with my flashlight, trying to get a glimpse of whatever was in the room with us. The beam of my flashlight shone around wildly from one spot to another, where I'd last seen the movements. "Hello? Is anyone there?" Specialist Maxine announced loudly into the room, but before he could finish his sentence, his entire body was abruptly caught by a darting figure lunging onto him from behind and propelled both of the bodies forward into the darkness, causing him to drop his M4 onto the floor and killing the flashlight from the gun. "Help me, I can't see him, get it off of me!" His cries for help screeched in the pitch black distance, as suddenly deafening sprays of gunfire erupted from my right, as another one of my fellow teammates, Corporal Jackson, opened fire blindly in the general direction of a sudden figure that had dashed past his beam of light. "Contact," he quickly yelled, as Sergeant Volkers and Corporal Staples started wildly opening fire as well on several other figures that had quickly run past their lights, causing the entire cafeteria to momentarily light up in a blinding mixture of yellow and white flashes. Time seemed to crawl to a halt as I blanked out in the heat of the moment, the gunfire flashes irradiating the attacking figures as I caught a glimpse of their misshapen, malformed bodies, similar to that of burned victims, with brownish red spittle flying out from their jaw that hung at an unnatural angle. "What are we fighting?" Corporal Staples yelled in panic whilst blindly shooting, as his entire body was abruptly grabbed onto and yanked forward into the darkness, his desperate screams for help muffled in the deafening background gunfire. "Snap out of it, we've got to get the hell out of here," Sergeant Volkers yelled from the left as he started sprinting back towards the metal door, with Corporal Jackson hot on his heels, turning around for the last time and firing back into the inhuman screeches and howls of the figures. There I stood, both feet frozen to the ground in shock and fear from the events that had unfolded right in front of my eyes, as the gruff command from the sergeant snatched me out of my trance. I considered helping my other two teammates for a second, before silently uttering an apology, and ran after Jackson and the sergeant back through the metal doorway. Howls and angry, animalistic screams bounced off the corridor as the huge metal door vibrated and held under the bashes and attacks that came from the other side. I was on my knees, panting and breathless as I clutched the rifle, my hand trembling in terror. Sergeant Volkers held the door shut along with Corporal Jackson as the unrelenting bashing from the other side of the door kept up with their siege to break in. The three of us knew what had to be done next was inevitable, as the bashing and thumping of the door started to grow stronger and louder by the second. Sergeant Volkers was the first to break the silence between the three of us as he handed me his dog tag without saying a word. "Lads, do me a favour. Find those geneticists and get the hell out of this hellhole. I'll hold these guys off. Hurry." Corporal Jackson protested as he tried to change the sergeant's mind from his sacrifice attempt. The metal door inched forward in a desperate push to break in as Sergeant Volkers shook his head and slammed it back into place with a loud grunt. He produced 2 frag grenades from his vest as he clutched one in both hands. "There's no time. Either you wanted those 2 other deaths to be in vain, or the whole goddamn team. Go now, that's an order." The howls in the background faded and mixed into the howling of the wind as we passed the previous body lying against the wall in a running sprint and climbed the metal stairs, reaching back onto the topside in mere minutes. Slamming the metal door shut behind us, a distant rumble of explosion resonated and echoed through the rig as the entire platform started to gently shake seconds after the blast. "Damn!" Corporal Jackson yelled furiously through the suit as he kicked the oxidized metal wall beside us, causing it to slightly dent from the impact. "Their deaths could have been prevented. We might have come up with something else if it wasn't for my goddamn idea to breach in. No, you did the right thing in trying to save whoever was behind the door. That was the original mission for the entire team." I tried to assure and empathize with him, as the sudden loud clack of the onboard PA system reminded both of us that the mission wasn't over yet. "Hello? Is this the rescue team? We're currently holed up and trapped in the control room. There's a couple of those things trying to break in." Upon hearing the announcement from the system, Corporal Jackson and I glanced at each other, exchanging subtle nods before taking off jogging towards a metal doorway further down the platform, this time with a directory map nailed to its side with faded description labels. I briefly scanned over and examined the directory with my gloved fingers as it unconsciously trailed down and pointed to a small location in the map which had an accompanying label that reads "Control Room." "Over there," Corporal Jackson examined, catching my attention as he motioned his fingers to point in the direction of a woman clad in a white lab coat waving at us from a window situated in a sizable 2-story tower. As we hastily made our way to the giant platform tower, the radio built into both of our suits suddenly burst to life, beeping in a quick and rhythmic manner. Whiskey 3, this is Vulture 2-2 on maximum fuel. We'll be on station for evac in ETA 10 minutes, out." I sighed in sheer relief as Corporal Jackson grinned from inside of his mask as we reached the smashed and warped metal door leading to the tower. "I'll take lead, watch my 6, he muttered as we ascended a spiraling grated stairwell with remnants of bloodstains and tiny pieces of decomposing flesh littering the metal, both floor and walls. The distinct sound of banging, blood-curdling screaming and howlings soon came into focus as we neared the top of the stairwell as I tightened my grip on the handle of the rifle. As we rounded the corner in the spiraling stairwell wall, we could make out a couple of figures, turning back towards us as they continued their relentless rampage on a metal door with visible damage and denting on its exterior. The figures, clad in the same working orange uniforms and construction helmets, were seen aggressively and violently bashing their heads into the body of the door, as one was seen repeatedly running into it with his body at full force, crimson red blood spilling all over the place and white tips of ribcage bone protruding from his back as he continued with the act as if nothing has happened, while screaming and howling frantically. "Jesus, what the hell?" Corporal Jackson whispered as the figures abruptly stopped in their actions and spun around faster than we could react as their dead, glazed-over eyes stared right into us, dilated pupils twitching randomly. Nobody moved for a split second, and as the once human figures finally registered our presence with them, they started frenziedly dashing towards us at full speed before we could even react and pull the trigger. In a split second, one of them was closing in on Corporal Jackson, her upper movements jerky and convulsing. I pulled the trigger without thinking in my shock-filled state, the 5.56 rounds impacting and tearing through her decomposing shoulders and up her head as she was sent barreling through the air and tumbling past Corporal Jackson, rolling down the stairs. Corporal Jackson opened fire on the other figures as they were stopped in their tracks by the hail of bullets and tumbled to the floor, still spasming and gurgling out blood as they slowly succumbed to their fatal injuries. Panting and taking a breather, I cautiously stepped over the bodies laying on the floor, riddled with blooded holes as a small pool of blood emerged from under them, as I gave the metal door several loud knocks. "Open up, we're with the CDC," I called out, lowering my weapon as I motioned Corporal Jackson over to me. Sounds of unlocking could be heard from the other side as the door slowly inched open, leaving a tiny gap as an eye peeked out and examined me and Corporal Jackson before swinging wide open, revealing a dark-haired female scientist dressed in a bloodstained lab coat, her hair ruffled and disheveled. Behind her sat a rig worker, clad in the same dirty orange uniform and looking quite rather exhausted. "Thank God you guys had finally arrived. We hunkered down here in the control room when the rig went into lockdown. My other partner went out and made the distress calls from the comms room, but she hasn't returned since." Corporal Jackson shot me a pitiful glance, as we both knew deep down she was already dead. "You're the working geneticist scientist, right?" I cautiously inquired, as she confirmed the statement by nodding her head. "The evac helicopter should be here any time soon to get you guys out. We have..." My words were quickly muffled out by the roar of a colossal explosion resounding and bouncing off the walls as the entire control room shook violently, throwing us off our feet. Mugs, keyboards, computer monitors clattered and smashed into the floor around us as the lights suddenly went out. The room shook once more as the facility fire alarm started blaring. The wailing of the shrill alarm echoed all throughout the vicinity as we laid on the debris-stricken floor, groaning in pain. Our radio screamed to life as a familiar voice blared through the speakers, vibrating from the intensity. "Vulture 2-2 is at the station and in position. We have confirmation visuals of flames on the rig. Get your asses out of here before the place blows up. The scientist groaned as the rig worker stumbled to his feet, holding onto the control panel where he lost balance and fell backwards onto the floor. "What's happening?" he yelped as he tried to hoist himself back up. "This damn thing is sinking, probably from Sergeant's grenades. Anyway, we've got to go, now." Corporal Jackson shouted over the wail of the alarm as he climbed back onto his feet, grabbing his rifle and speaking into the radio. "Damn, Vulture 2-2, this is Whiskey. On your feet, soldier. We're gonna get the hell out of here," he yelled as he gripped my right hand, hoisting me up in an instant as he dashed to the door. I grabbed my rifle and helped the scientist up to her feet as the construction workers stood up and followed suit after us through the doorway. Upon exiting the tower, we were greeted with a sight and smell of what could only be described as total anarchy. The metal catwalk bridges ahead of us slung dangerously to the sides as fiery flames licked every corner as far as I could see through the clouds of smoke. Another smaller explosion resonated behind us from a distance, sending fragments of the catwalk hurling down onto us from above as we covered our heads with our arms and hands. The lingering scent of copper and melted wires penetrated our gas masks and into our noses as we ran through the thick black smoke, following Corporal Jackson as he led us into a splitting intersection in the catwalk. A distinct and muffled roar of a helicopter could be heard above the sounds of chaos. "This way, go, go, keep moving," he called out while dodging the fires as the massive crane of the oil rig groaned loudly under stress, tilting inwards and coming crashing down onto the control tower that we had just been in earlier. Had we not left it sooner, we might have been squashed like bugs. The impact of its crash came with the result of the platform tilting dangerously to one side, as we were once again thrown off our feet, this time, thankfully, holding onto the catwalk handrail. "How far is it to the helicopter?" the worker shouted in frustration as he ran in front of me, mouth and nose covered with his arm to prevent inhalation. "We're almost there. Move, move," Corporal Jackson shouted angrily as the whirring of the helicopter rotor blades came into focus. The smoke parted as I could see the military helicopter in all of its magnificent glory, hovering just above the edge of the platform, doors slung wide open as the pilot directed the bird closer to the edge, its sides scraping against the paint of the catwalk. "Get in the chopper," the radio screamed as we ran towards the helicopter, with Corporal Jackson being the first on board, followed by the geneticist and the worker. I was about to board the helicopter when I was suddenly thrown backwards, with the catwalk breaking apart and bending into two as the massive rig tilted into an angle, which I was now meters away from the helicopter as the pilot desperately tried to hold it together and stabilize. "Come on, jump for it," Corporal Jackson shouted over the terrified screams of the scientist as the helicopter hovered unsteadily, the distance between me and the helicopter increasing by the second. I took a deep breath and readied myself as I sprinted to the edge of the catwalk before leaping with all of my might. I fell flat on my chest onto the helicopter floor, my gun clattering to the side as I began slipping on the wet surface of the metal and slid backwards into the edge of the helicopter. My whole body dangled from the edge, but right before I was about to fall off, a firm gloved hand gripped my arm tightly as Corporal Jackson pulled me back on board. "I gotcha," he said as he hoisted me back up from the edge of the helicopter, the sounds of the explosion still audible from behind me. "We're all on board. Go." "Roger that. The asset has been secured. Vulture returning back to base. Out," the co-pilot announced as the helicopter flew away from the rig, leaving behind the stricken oil rig as it commenced its final explosion in the last few seconds, sending out blinding bright light and a massive cloud of detritus and rubble as it broke away, slowly sinking into the stormy ocean. It has been 19 years since the dismissal of the offshore disaster as a freak accident, the government covering up the whole story as just a malfunctioning drilling system going awry on board. I left the CDC and my whole life back there behind for good, given the NDA slip that has kept my mouth shut and prohibited me from even hinting at the existence of this story. My contract has already ended 4 days ago, and I have been debating whether to reveal the story or not from there ever since. Some things in the world are just not meant to be discovered, and we should just remain blissfully unaware of the hidden dangers that lurk in our very planet. I just hope in my heart that the poor souls on board the rig during that fateful night rest in peace under the sea, alongside with Sergeant Volker's, Specialist Maxian, and Corporal Staples. That is all that I have for you, and whatever that you do, please don't go searching for Watchtower 1. ran wild when I was a teenager. Looking back, I believe that joining the army saved me from jail. That's not why I signed up. I walked into the recruiter's office because I had seen how the most beautiful girls all flocked around the soldier boys in my local bar one Saturday night, not long before the fight broke out that left me with a split lip. The sergeant behind the desk eyed me up with a dour expression that looked like it had been carved onto his face, then slid over a form for me to read and sign. "You know which way up to hold a pen?" he asked. I wanted to tell him to go to hell, but I wanted myself a uniform and a gal draped over my shoulder more, so I buttoned it. In the 5 years since then, knowing when to keep my mouth shut had been a saving grace for me in the infantry. I'm not the strongest or the fastest, but I've never questioned an order out loud and have always got to it as quickly as I could. As the truck carried us towards the city, I sat in silence, ready for whatever was about to be thrown at me next. A storm was hot on our heels, a bad one. It was due to reach the city in a few hours' time, and the authorities had ordered a total evacuation and requested military support. The army did not regard grunts like us as important enough to have a view from our transport, but as the miles passed, the constant sound of horns sounding, of sirens wailing, and the chatter of helicopter blades passing overhead made my skin tingle with anticipation. We disembarked at 1700 hours. The NCOs screamed at us to move it. Out on the street, dusk was beginning to shroud the office blocks, which rose around us in darkness. We lined up and stood to attention as an officer addressed us. "This is a covert mission. It will not be included in the official records, and you will not talk about it. Drunk or sober or in the throes of passion with the toothless, cross-eyed loves of your lives. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," we cried out as one. No clearer what our task was, but more wired by the minute. I fell into step behind the man in front of me when the order came. "Single file." We moved forwards and I realized we were heading underground. A manhole cover was propped open and the soldiers in front of me were scrambling down it. When my turn came, I descended a narrow ladder affixed to the side of the wall. When my boots reached the bottom, I could just about make out that I was in a narrow tunnel. My breath frosted in the air, and an intense stench of decay made me feel suddenly sick. Further along the tunnel, out of my sight, some wit called out, "We helping the rats relocate, Sergeant?" The reply shot back, amplified in the claustrophobic space. "Zip it. There are low-life scum using these tunnels to hide in. We're going to flush them out, and when we reach the surface, there'll be a nice surprise waiting for them. 1,000 rounds a minute worth of instant justice, all out of sight of the bleeding heart civilians." My mouth felt very dry. Using the storm as cover to take out bad guys like this appalled me. But I had my orders, and I would obey. I tried to breathe nice and slow. We set off, soon branching off into groups of 6 as the tunnel split and split again. I was the tail of our drab snake. As we progressed, I wondered what kind of people were using this network of tunnels to evade the law, wondered what crimes they'd committed to bring in highly trained troops to deal with them. Whoever they were, whatever they had done, they did not stand a chance. The soldier ahead of me broke wind. A quiet yee-haw followed from further down the line. The best of the best, I thought with a wry grin as I passed a new tunnel branching off to one side. We had not deviated down it. We were clearly keeping on straight ahead. I glanced down the new tunnel, wondering where it led, and saw movement, I said clearly into my radio. I'd been able to make out no details, just a blur of something travelling at speeds across the far end of the new tunnel, which must, I figure, have led to yet another tunnel which ran parallel to the one we were in. A moment of static followed. Then, "Acknowledged. Double check all weapons live." I have no idea how we were meant to open fire in here, if it came to that, without serious risk of hitting each other. But mine was not to wonder why. Mine was to do and... "Sergeant, possible hostiles, 3 o'clock. The voice on the radio crackled in my headset. "Eyes to your right, boys. came the reply. I tensed. It looked like it was time to flush some criminal dirt out into the vengeful light of day. The scream filled the tunnel. There was a heartbeat of silence, and then everyone tried speaking on their radios at once. He came out of the tunnel. Grabbed him. Hold your fire, Tarkowski. Can you hear me? Copy. I could see nothing. Just the forms of the soldiers in front of me in the gloom. I knew Tarkowski. He had drank me under the table on more than one occasion, had a goofy grin and a child on the way. I said a silent prayer that he was okay, and steadied myself. The call came over the radio again. Tarkowski, respond. He did not reply. I swore quietly. We needed to get moving again. If Tarkowski had been picked off by hostiles in one of the parallel tunnels, we were an easy target. Finally, the order came. Backtrack, we're going to the surface, regroup. But it was too late. Gunfire exploded. The sound in the confined space set off explosions of pain in my ears. Men were shouting. The man in front of me stumbled, fell to his knees. I grabbed him, tried to haul him back up. All the while, the sergeant was trying to hold back the chaos by yelling orders into the radio. He was so much white noise. I managed to get the soldier to his feet, then something tore him away from me, pulled him back to the ground, and there was a shape on him. Some body, some thing that held his neck in his jaws and was biting. The soldier's body thrashed and his hands beat at the thing that was attacking him. Moments later, he fell still, and the thing on top of him looked up at me. Blood dripped from its teeth. It reared up, leapt towards me. I felt the impact, then nothing more. I don't know how much time passed before I came round. My eyes were drawn first to the flickering light, the naked flame of a candle. I realized as my sight cleared, the white wax stem was mounted in an ornate holder which twisted with an S shape down to the ground, where bones lay scattered. There were human skulls and rib cages, legs and arms, some broken, some whole, and what looked like skeletons of foxes and rats. All were intermingled and rose to form a platform on which sat a nightmare made real. I say she because the curves of her chest, visible beneath the torn, filthy rags she wore, rested on a throne of death. I began to retch. Around her feet lay bodies still wearing military uniforms. The pale skin was tight over the bone beneath, as if the blood that ran in their veins and nestled in their flesh had been taken. My comrades, murdered, defiled. I spat, tried to raise my head in defiance, tried to hide the terror I was feeling in every fibre of my being. "What the hell are you?" I asked. Her skin was wrinkled and scarred and danced with fleas, and when she smiled, as she did at my question, jagged teeth were revealed. She lifted one hand, waved long fingers, each nail of which looked as if it had been decorated with fresh blood. At this, a dozen creatures emerged from behind the throne and advanced on me. Like her, they wore rags over filthy, damaged skin. Pus hung from open wounds on some as they half crawled, half walked towards me. I saw that one held something clasped in its hand. It opened its fingers and threw a toy soldier at my feet. This was a couple of inches tall, made of green plastic. I'd played with toys like this when I was a boy, but what were these revolting things doing with it? The creature looked at me. Its eyes were narrow and clouded over, those of a being which favoured the dark over light. It pointed at the toy, pointed at me. Then a second of the creatures came forward. From its hand threw a small wooden block, another child's plaything. There was a question mark painted on the block. The paint was cracked and faded with age. The rest of the things then compounded my confusion by throwing forward dozens more toy soldiers. "I don't know what you want with me," I managed to say, "but all you'll get is name, rank and serial number, and a promise to see you burn in hell." The creatures turned to look at the she-thing who sat watching over us. She stood slowly and, with a twisted grace, descended. This sent the other things into a frenzy of activity that ended with more wooden blocks being laid at her feet. She studied them for a moment, and then one by one started to push individual blocks forward with her hands. Each block had a letter of the alphabet painted on it. Seeming satisfied, she stepped back. I read down the line of blocks. How many like you? I answered by aiming a wad of spit at her. It fell short, but I figured she had got the message. There was intelligence here, and she was clearly the smartest, the queen of the pack. I figured they had spared me to get intel on the scale of the attack that was being mounted on them. If I was to survive, I needed to act, and fast. But there was no way I was going to betray my fellow soldiers. To buy time, I pointed at the mold of toy soldiers. At a nod from her hideousness, the other creatures pushed them closer to me. I began to slowly count out plastic figurines. They watched me, seemingly transfixed, grotesquely childlike. I took my chance, threw myself at the knife I'd seen still in the belt of one of my butchered comrades, freed it, span round and pressed the blade against the queen's throat. "Unless you want a new leader, I suggest you all back off," I told them. They cowered, waiting, it seemed, for a signal. But she kept her hands by her side and did not struggle as I began to walk us away, through the tunnels until we reached the ladder reaching upwards. I held the blade closer, allowed it to dig into her skin, whispered, "Don't." We emerged into the street. There was no one else in sight, no sirens. The storm was here and the city appeared deserted. Wind and rain battered against us. I felt exhilarated. I held her tighter still. Her skin was hot and she smelled of fear, of danger, of the darkness and everything that was forbidden. My pulse racing, I led us away, into the night. I had escaped, with my life. I am off grid now, scavenging what I need and living in a derelict building on the edge of the city. After what happened, I can no longer follow orders, and I cannot live as an ordinary man again. I will live and die as I choose, free of all the constraints I once knew. I checked there was no one in sight out on the street and slipped through the broken door back inside the old abandoned warehouse. It was dark, cold. The musk of death and decay greeted me. I took the meat I'd stolen from the butcher's van to her. I held the small carcasses over her mouth and let the blood drip. She sighed, then pushed one of the wooden blocks she cradled in her lap towards me. Her fingers lingered on the faded rose-red heart painted on it. I put my hand on her ravaged skin and leant in for a kiss.